The moment I walked my fiancé through the mahogany doors of my family's Chicago estate, my father's open palm cracked across my jaw. The sound echoed over the crystal glasses and silver dinner plates. "We do not mix with scavengers," my father hissed, staring with pure disgust at my fiancé's faded linen jacket. I held my burning cheek and refused to shed a single tear. I just smiled. Then my fiancé cleared his throat, stepped forward, and calmly stated his last name. I watched the blood drain from my father's face. He just realized the scavenger standing in his dining room was the sole heir to the exact private equity firm holding the leash on his entire real estate empire. "My name is Claire. I am 30 years old, and I work as a forensic auditor. Before I tell you how I systematically dismantled my own family's wealth, tell me where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe arrogant people always fall into their own traps. Let me take you back to that Friday night. The Preston family dinners were always a display of wealth and dominance. My father Richard sat at the head of the long marble table pouring vintage wine. He built Preston Realty into a Chicago powerhouse through sheer ruthlessness. For 8 years, I scrubbed his financial records clean. I hid the discrepancies, balanced the bleeding budgets, and kept the auditors away. In return, he treated me like disposable staff. Across the table sat my older sister, Jessica. She wore a diamond necklace that cost more than my annual salary. Next to her sat her husband, Marcus. Marcus is a highly successful African-American venture capitalist. He wore a tailored charcoal suit and a smug expression. Richard constantly paraded Marcus around high society to project an image of modern, untouchable power. They were the golden couple. I was the stain on the family name. I stepped into the dining room holding Julian's hand. Julian wore a simple, unbranded linen jacket and scuffed boots. He looked like an ordinary teacher or a struggling writer. Richard took one look at Julian and slammed his wine glass down. The crystal shattered against the floor, sending red liquid pooling across the white marble. "Get that trash out of my house," Richard commanded. His voice dripped with raw contempt. I tightened my grip on Julian's hand. "This is my fiancé," I stated, keeping my voice dead level. "We are getting married." Marcus let out a loud, mocking laugh. He leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms. "Claire, are you running a charity now?" Marcus sneered. "He looks like he begs for change on the subway." Jessica rolled her eyes and took a slow sip of her wine. "God, Claire, you always find new ways to embarrass us. Just kick him out, Dad. He is ruining my appetite." Richard stood up. He marched across the room, his heavy footsteps echoing on the tile. He stopped inches from my face. "I told you to marry into influence. Instead, you dragged this pathetic leech into my dining room to siphon off my money." "He is not a leech," I fired back. Richard's hand lashed out. His palm struck the side of my face with a sickening crack. The force snapped my head to the side. The metallic taste of blood flooded my mouth. I stood perfectly still. I did not raise a hand to touch my cheek. I looked my father dead in the eyes and smiled. Julian did not yell. He did not throw a punch. He simply reached into the inner pocket of his faded jacket and pulled out a heavy, matte black business card. He dropped it onto the pristine marble table right in front of my father. "The name is Julian Kensington," he said softly. His tone carried the quiet authority of a man who owned the room. "I believe your firm owes Kensington Holdings $50 million by the end of this month, Richard, a debt you currently lack the liquidity to pay." Richard stared at the gold-embossed lettering on the card. The air left his lungs. His arrogant posture collapsed. He looked from the card to the faded linen jacket, his eyes wide with sheer panic. Marcus sat up straight, the smug grin wiped off his face. Kensington Holdings was the apex predator of the financial world, and Richard had just assaulted the future CEO's fiancé. "You have 30 days to find the money," Julian added. "We will not accept delays." Julian took my hand again. We turned our backs on the silent, terrified room and walked out the front door into the cold Chicago night. The war had officially begun. The crisp night air hit my face the moment Julian pushed open the heavy oak doors of the Preston estate. We stepped out onto the granite driveway. Behind us, the house stood silent and imposing a monument to my father's ruthless ambition. I did not look back. I kept my eyes fixed on the black sedan idling near the wrought iron gates. Julian kept his hand firmly wrapped around mine. His grip offered a steady grounding anchor amidst the adrenaline surging through my veins. Before we even reached the car, my phone began to vibrate in my coat pocket. It was not a single notification. It was a relentless synchronized barrage of alerts. I slid into the leather seat of the sedan. Julian sat beside me, his posture rigid, his eyes scanning my face in the dim light of the street lamps. I pulled my phone from my pocket. The screen lit up the dark interior of the car, displaying a cascade of digital executions. Richard was not a man who waited to exact his revenge. He operated with lethal efficiency. The first alert came from the primary banking app. A red banner splashed across the screen. Access denied. The platinum card tied to the Preston Family Trust had been frozen. A second alert followed instantly. The secondary accounts, the emergency funds, even the modest savings account connected to the firm payroll. All locked. Richard had severed my financial arteries before I even cleared the perimeter of his property. I swiped the notifications away. I did not care about the money. I had known the financial cutoff was coming. But the third email that popped into my inbox made my chest tighten. The sender was the family's private healthcare concierge. The subject line read, "Immediate termination of benefits." I stared at the glowing text. Richard had revoked my premium health insurance coverage. He knew exactly what he was doing. I manage a severe autoimmune condition that requires monthly infusions. Those infusions cost thousands of dollars per treatment. Without that specific insurance policy, my medical routine would crumble. My father did not just want to make me poor. He wanted to break me physically. He wanted me sick, desperate, and crawling back to his marble foyer begging for a lifeline. A harsh metallic chime interrupted my thoughts. A new voicemail notification popped onto the screen. It was from Jessica. I tapped the screen and pressed the phone to my ear. "You actually think you won?" Jessica hissed through the speaker. Her voice shook with a toxic mixture of panic and pure spite. "You bring a Kensington into our dining room and drop a threat like that. You are a gold-digging whore, Claire. You have always been a jealous, pathetic parasite trying to ruin this family. Dad is erasing you. Do not ever show your face near this estate again. If you step foot near Preston Realty, Marcus will have his security team throw you onto the pavement. You are dead to us." The audio cut off with a sharp click. I lowered the phone and let it rest on my lap. I looked out the tinted window of the sedan. The city lights blurred into streaks of yellow and white. Jessica called me a parasite. She called me a gold-digging whore. The irony tasted like ash in my mouth. For 8 agonizing years, I was the unseen engine keeping the Preston family empire from plunging into a federal indictment. I spent my nights in a sterile, fluorescent-lit office, combing through decades of Richard's chaotic ledgers. I used my forensic accounting credentials to scrub his tracks. When he moved capital through offshore shell companies to avoid taxation, I stayed up for days restructuring the corporate portfolios to make them compliant. And then there was Marcus, Jessica's perfect, untouchable husband. Marcus posed as a brilliant venture capitalist, giving interviews to financial magazines and wearing custom suits. But his investment portfolio was a graveyard of bad bets and catastrophic losses. He hemorrhaged millions of dollars on reckless startups. Whenever his investors demanded audits, Marcus would panic. He would come to my office after midnight, dropping boxes of forged invoices onto my desk. I spent 3 years burying his financial failures deep within the quarterly reports of Preston Realty. I fabricated growth models. I shielded him from the Securities and Exchange Commission. I kept Marcus out of a prison cell. I saved them all over and over again. They never thanked me. They paid me a standard salary, shoved me into a basement office, and paraded their success across Chicago high society. I was the janitor cleaning up their golden messes, and the moment I brought a man who held real power into their home, they discarded me like infected waste. Julian shifted in his seat. The ambient light caught the sharp angle of his jaw. He saw the cold, detached expression settling over my features. He reached over and gently took the phone from my hands. He scrolled through the alerts. He saw the banking freezes. He read the insurance termination email. He played Jessica's voice memo out loud in the quiet space of the car. The temperature in the sedan seemed to drop 10 degrees. Julian handed the phone back to me. His expression did not change, but a dangerous, calculating stillness took over his entire demeanor. He leaned forward and tapped the glass partition separating us from the driver. "Pull over," Julian instructed. The driver smoothly maneuvered the heavy sedan to the side of the road and shifted into park. Julian unbuttoned his faded linen jacket and reached for his own phone. He unlocked the screen and pulled up a contact list. "I am calling my chief financial officer." He stated, his voice a low, even murmur. "I am initiating the default protocols on Preston Realty right now. By 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, Richard will find his corporate accounts frozen. Marcus will find his venture capital firm locked out of every major trading platform. I am going to trigger a margin call that will force them to liquidate everything they own just to keep the lights on. They want to cut your lifeline. I am going to end theirs." His thumb hovered over the call button. The power of Kensington Holdings was ready to strike like a tactical strike team. Julian had the authority to obliterate my family's wealth with a single phone call. I reached out and wrapped my fingers around his wrist. Julian paused. He looked down at my hand, then up to my eyes. His gaze searched mine for a trace of hesitation or fear. He found neither. "Stop," I said softly. "Do not make the call." "Claire, they just cut off the medical insurance keeping you healthy," Julian replied. His tone remained calm, but the undercurrent of protective fury was unmistakable. "Your father just slapped you. Your sister just threatened you. I am not going to let them sleep soundly tonight. I will dismantle Preston Realty before sunrise." I squeezed his wrist. "If you crush them right now, you give them exactly what they want. You give them a scapegoat." Julian lowered his phone slightly, but did not lock the screen. "Explain." "If Kensington Holdings drops the hammer tomorrow morning, Richard will play the victim," I said, keeping my voice methodical and clear. "He will go to his country clubs and tell every wealthy investor in Chicago that a giant corporate conglomerate bullied a local business. He will hide behind his lawyers. He will move his remaining liquid assets into hidden trusts before your compliance team can track them. Marcus will run to the press and claim his firm is being targeted unfairly. They will declare bankruptcy, restructure their debt, and walk away with millions hidden in the Cayman Islands. They will survive this." Julian watched me intently. He recognized the strategic mind of the auditor taking over. "What is your alternative?" I let go of his wrist and leaned back against the leather seat. For 8 years, I mapped every single fault line in their empire. I know the exact routing numbers for the offshore accounts Richard uses to dodge the IRS. I know the specific dates Marcus forged his investment returns. I know which politicians they bribed to secure zoning permits. I know the passwords, the hidden servers, the dummy corporations. I turned my head to look out the window at the towering skyscrapers of downtown Chicago. If you freeze their accounts, they just lose money. That is not enough anymore. They tried to break me tonight. They tried to leave me sick and penniless. I do not want to just bankrupt them, Julian. I want them in federal prison. I want Richard to lose his freedom. I want Marcus stripped of his licenses. I want Jessica to watch the authorities carry her diamond necklaces out the front door in evidence boxes. Julian slowly locked his phone and placed it into his jacket pocket. The faint hint of a smile touched the corner of his mouth. He recognized the lethal patience in my voice. He understood the difference between a swift execution and a calculated dismantling. "How do we begin?" Julian asked. I turned back to him. "We let them think they won. We let Richard believe he successfully cut me off. He is arrogant. He believes I am helpless without the family trust. By Monday morning, he will try to secure a new bridge loan to cover the $50 million he owes you. He will use Marcus to manipulate the venture capital markets. Let them scramble. Let them forge new documents. While they are busy trying to plug the holes in a sinking ship, I am going to access the archived servers. I am going to package every piece of forensic evidence I have gathered over the last 8 years." I took a slow, steady breath. The sting on my cheek had faded into a dull throb. The panic they expected me to feel did not exist. I felt nothing but a pure, crystalline focus. "Drive me to my apartment," I told him. "I need my encrypted hard drives." They thought they were throwing out the garbage tonight. They forgot the garbage holds all the keys to the kingdom. 3 days passed in a tense, calculating silence. I returned to my position at the independent auditing firm downtown operating, as if the confrontation in my father's dining room never occurred. I knew Richard and Marcus were plotting their retaliation. They were cornered animals, and men who build empires on fraudulent ledgers do not surrender without drawing blood. I expected legal threats or a barrage of cease and desist letters. I underestimated the sheer targeted precision of my brother-in-law's desperation. Marcus built his entire venture capital career on the illusion of untouchable influence. Richard loved to parade Marcus through the elite social clubs of Chicago. My father used Marcus's African-American heritage and sleek modern business persona to project an image of progressive dynamic power to the old guard of real estate. Behind closed doors, Marcus was nothing more than Richard's favored pawn, a man willing to forge quarterly returns to maintain his lavish lifestyle. Marcus held deep connections across Wall Street. He knew how to pull the invisible strings of the financial sector. On Wednesday morning, those strings snapped shut around my neck. I sat at my workstation reviewing a routine tax compliance report for a mid-sized tech client. The digital clock on my monitor read 9:15. The glass door to the auditing floor opened, and the Director of Human Resources stepped through. Director Cole was a rigid, risk-averse man who usually communicated through email. He walked straight toward my desk. He did not carry a clipboard or a tablet. He held a single printed manila folder. He refused to meet my eyes. "Claire, I need you in my office," Cole instructed. His tone lacked his usual corporate courtesy. "We need to have a conversation regarding an urgent legal inquiry." I saved my current spreadsheet, locked my screen, and stood up. I followed him down the long corridor, noting the subtle shifts in the office atmosphere. The legal counsel for our firm was already sitting inside Cole's office, shifting uncomfortably in a leather chair. The moment the door clicked shut, the silence grew thick and suffocating. Cole sat behind his desk and opened the manila folder. He slid a single sheet of paper toward me. It was a formal notice of suspension. "Effective immediately, you are placed on unpaid administrative leave, pending a comprehensive internal investigation," Cole stated. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted his glasses. "We received a formal complaint from the legal department representing Preston Realty and a coalition of venture capital investors managed by your brother-in-law." I looked at the document. I did not touch it. "On what grounds?" I asked. My voice remained entirely flat. "Corporate espionage and breach of fiduciary duty," the firm's legal counsel interjected. He leaned forward, attempting to assert authority. "Marcus filed a sworn affidavit this morning. He claims you utilized your credentials at this firm to unlawfully extract, copy, and distribute confidential financial data belonging to the Preston Family Trust and his private equity investors. He alleges you intended to sell proprietary trading algorithms to rival firms. Furthermore, Marcus leveraged his Wall Street partnerships to threaten our firm's standing. I made it clear that if we do not isolate you from our servers immediately, his coalition will pull every contract they hold with our auditing partners. The strategy was ruthless and effective. Marcus hit my employer where it hurt the most. He threatened their revenue stream and their reputation. He framed me as a rogue auditor, willing to sell client secrets to the highest bidder." Cole cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of the room. "Claire, you understand the gravity of these accusations. A data leak of this magnitude could destroy our firm. We have no choice but to suspend your access. You must surrender your security badge, your company phone, and your laptop immediately." Most employees facing an abrupt, unpaid suspension based on severe federal allegations would panic. They would cry, defend their character, or plead for their job. I did none of those things. I knew panic was the exact reaction Marcus wanted to provoke. He wanted me disoriented and desperate. I leaned back in my chair and looked directly into Cole's eyes. "I understand you are acting under duress, Director Cole," I replied. "But you are a professional auditor. You deal in data, not hearsay. If I initiated an unauthorized data transfer of that scale, the firewall would have triggered an automated alert. Our cybersecurity protocols mandate a digital receipt for any file export exceeding the standard threshold." I gestured toward the formal notice on the desk. "Before I surrender my hardware, I require you to pull the server access logs from my employee identification number over the past 72 hours. I also request the immediate preservation of the security camera footage covering my physical workstation. You will find zero evidence of any data extraction. Marcus is lying, and he is using this firm as a weapon." The legal counsel scoffed. "We cannot ignore a sworn affidavit from a major venture capitalist based on your word, Claire. The investigation will determine the facts. For now, you are a security risk." I stared at the lawyer, ignoring his condescending tone. As I processed the specific wording of Marcus's complaint, the true architecture of his plan crystallized in my mind. Marcus did not care about getting me fired. Getting me fired was merely a convenient byproduct. The real objective was hidden within the legal mechanics of the corporate espionage investigation itself. By filing a formal complaint regarding stolen data, Preston Realty's legal team would demand the right to audit my workstation. They would file a subpoena to seize my hard drive and search the firm's central servers to track the supposed leak. They were not looking for data I had stolen. They were looking for the data I had hidden. 2 years ago, Marcus made a catastrophic error. He routed a $12 million loss from a failed tech startup through a dummy corporation in the Cayman Islands. He attempted to use Preston Realty's capital to cover the margin call. I was the one who caught the discrepancy. I spent 4 days untangling his fraudulent wire transfers. I scrubbed the official ledger to keep the IRS away, but I never deleted the original unedited financial records. I archived those original files in a heavily encrypted partition deep within my current firm's legacy servers. It was my insurance policy. I called it the Ghost Ledger. Marcus knew the Ghost Ledger existed. He knew I held the exact routing numbers and forged signatures that could send him to federal prison for tax evasion and wire fraud. This suspension was a Trojan horse. Marcus orchestrated this entire HR crisis to gain legal authorization to breach my firm's IT department. His lawyers would seize my laptop, access the servers under the guise of an investigation, and quietly delete the Ghost Ledger. He was trying to erase his digital fingerprints before Julian's compliance team at Kensington Holdings could demand a formal audit. A cold, calculating satisfaction settled over me. Marcus was terrified. He was making desperate, sloppy moves. I reached into my pocket and placed my company phone on the desk. I unclipped my security badge from my lapel and set it down next to the phone. I did not argue. I did not waste my breath trying to convince Cole of my innocence. I knew the IT department would mirror my hard drive by noon. I will comply fully with your investigation, Director Cole, I stated calmly. I stood up and smoothed the front of my skirt. I highly recommend you bring in an independent forensic IT specialist to review my server logs. Do not allow outside legal counsel to conduct the digital sweep. You might find that the people demanding this investigation have ulterior motives regarding your server architecture. I turned and walked out of the office. I moved past the rows of cubicles, ignoring the whispered conversations and the curious stares of my colleagues. I walked out the glass front doors of the building and stepped onto the busy Chicago sidewalk. The morning air felt sharp against my skin. Marcus thought he had outsmarted me. He thought revoking my corporate access would sever my connection to the Ghost Ledger. He failed to realize one crucial detail about a seasoned forensic auditor. We never build a vault without installing a back door. I reached into my handbag and pulled out my personal cell phone. I navigated to a secure, unmarked application buried in a folder on the second page of my home screen. I tapped a 12-digit alphanumeric sequence into the interface. The screen flashed green. The Ghost Ledger was not just sitting on the company server. It was linked to an automated dead man's switch. By initiating the suspension and locking my credentials, Marcus inadvertently triggered the very protocol he was trying to prevent. I smiled, watching the digital confirmation appear on my screen. The forged invoices and offshore routing numbers were already compiling into a compressed file, preparing for an encrypted transmission to a secure cloud drive. Marcus wanted a war over data. He had no idea I had just armed the nuclear warhead. The scent of roasted espresso beans and burnt milk usually offered a comforting background hum for deep analytical work. That afternoon, the bustling atmosphere of the independent coffee shop in the Loop felt grating. I sat at a small corner table nursing a tepid black coffee. My laptop screen displayed the encrypted dashboard of the cloud drive where the Ghost Ledger currently resided. I was methodically categorizing the illicit wire transfers, cross-referencing Marcus's offshore shell companies against Richard's falsified quarterly tax filings. The data painted a damning portrait of a family empire built entirely on financial quicksand. The bell above the cafe door chimed. I did not look up from my screen. The heavy, rhythmic click of expensive heels moving sharply across the tiled floor signaled her approach long before she stood over my table. Diana, my mother, did not offer a greeting. She bypassed the polite social fictions entirely. She wore a tailored crimson coat and a severe expression that pulled the skin tight across her cheekbones. She slammed a thick leather-bound portfolio down onto the small wooden table. The impact rattled my coffee cup, sending a dark splash over the rim. I slowly lifted my eyes from the laptop monitor. Diana glared down at me, her eyes narrowed with a potent mixture of desperation and fury. "Sign it," Diana demanded. Her voice cut through the ambient chatter of the cafe, sharp and unyielding. I did not reach for the portfolio. I maintained my steady, analytical gaze. "What is this?" I asked, my tone entirely devoid of emotional inflection. Diana leaned forward, bracing her hands on the edge of the table. "You know exactly what it is, Claire. It is an asset relinquishment agreement. It legally transfers the 10% equity stake your grandmother foolishly left in your name directly back into the primary family holding company. Richard needs that equity to secure a secondary line of credit by tomorrow morning. Your little stunt with that Kensington boy triggered a panic among our private investors. Richard's primary lenders are threatening to call in their loans. We need that 10% to stabilize the portfolio." I looked at the leather folder, then back up to my mother. The sheer audacity of her demand bordered on delusional. For years, Diana ignored the existence of my grandmother's trust. She mocked the minor equity stake as a sentimental, worthless gesture. Now that same equity was the only life raft keeping the Preston family from drowning in debt. "You want me to surrender my grandmother's equity to save Richard's fraudulent real estate projects," I clarified. Diana's jaw tightened. She hated being challenged, especially by the daughter she viewed as disposable. "You owe this family, Claire. We raised you. We provided for you. You will sign the document, and you will sever all contact with that Kensington fraud immediately. You are going to call him, apologize for your hysterical behavior, and tell him the engagement is off. If you comply, Richard might reconsider freezing your accounts. We might allow you to return to the firm." The proposition was so entirely disconnected from reality that I almost laughed. Diana genuinely believed she still held leverage. She believed I was a frightened, obedient child, desperate for her approval and financial scraps. I slowly closed the lid of my laptop. I pushed the leather portfolio back across the table, stopping just short of her manicured fingers. "I am not signing anything," I stated calmly, "and I am certainly not breaking my engagement to Julian. Richard created this financial crisis through decades of reckless borrowing and fraudulent tax filings. Marcus exacerbated it with his catastrophic venture capital losses. You are bankrupt, Diana. My 10% equity cannot cover a $50 million deficit. You are bleeding out, and you are trying to plug a sinking ship with a Band-Aid." Diana's face flushed a deep, mottled red. The veins in her neck pulsed against the collar of her expensive coat. She had expected resistance, perhaps a tearful argument, or a plea for negotiation. She had not anticipated cold clinical rejection. "You ungrateful, spiteful little bitch," Diana hissed. The venom in her voice caused the two college students at the adjacent table to stop talking and stare. "You bring ruin to this family out of pure jealousy because you could never be Jessica. You could never secure a powerful man like Marcus. So you latch onto a Kensington and use his money to destroy your own father. I should have never given birth to you. You were a mistake from the beginning." I looked at the woman who birthed me. I searched her eyes for any flicker of maternal hesitation or regret. I found nothing but the frantic, ugly panic of a cornered narcissist watching her wealth evaporate. I reached for my coffee cup. "You are wasting your time, Diana. The conversation is over. Leave." Diana did not leave. Her control snapped completely. She reached across the table, her hand grabbing my ceramic mug. In one swift, violent motion, she hurled the tepid black coffee directly at me. The dark liquid splashed across my white blouse, soaking through the fabric and staining my collar. The cup clattered loudly onto the floor, shattering into sharp white shards. The cafe fell entirely silent. The barista behind the counter froze a pitcher of steamed milk suspended in midair. Every patron in the shop turned to witness the spectacle of an elegant older woman physically assaulting her daughter over a table. I sat perfectly still. The damp chill of the spilled coffee seeped into my skin. I did not jump up. I did not scream. I did not raise a hand to strike her back. I slowly reached for the dispenser on the table and pulled out a stack of coarse paper napkins. I calmly blotted the dark stain spreading across my blouse. Diana stood there breathing heavily, her chest heaving beneath the crimson coat. She looked at the mess she had created, expecting me to crumble into a sobbing, humiliated wreck. She expected me to flee the cafe in shame. Instead, I picked up my phone from the table. I opened the camera application and framed the leather-bound portfolio sitting next to my closed laptop. I ensured the title Asset Relinquishment Agreement was clearly visible in the shot. I tapped the shutter button, the quiet click echoing in the silent room. I looked up at my mother, wiping a stray drop of coffee from my chin. "Thank you, Diana," I said. My voice was steady, projecting clearly across the quiet room. Diana blinked, visibly thrown by my reaction. "Thank you for what?" she demanded, her voice wavering. I tapped the screen, saving the image to a secure folder. "Thank you for providing documented proof of attempted extortion and physical assault in front of a dozen witnesses," I replied. "The legal team at Kensington Holdings will find this extremely useful when we file for a protective order and initiate the asset forfeiture proceedings. I will ensure this relinquishment agreement is submitted into evidence as proof of Richard's desperate liquidity crisis." Diana stared at me, the reality of her colossal miscalculation slowly dawning in her eyes. She had just handed me a loaded weapon. I packed my laptop into my bag. I stood up, adjusting the strap over my shoulder. I ignored the coffee stains ruining my blouse. I looked down at the broken pieces of the ceramic mug scattered across the floor, then back up to the woman who used to be my mother. "I will see you in court, Diana." I turned and walked toward the exit. The patrons parted slightly as I moved through the aisle, their eyes wide with shock and morbid curiosity. I pushed open the glass door and stepped back out onto the street. The cold wind bit into the damp patches on my shirt, but I barely registered the discomfort. The adrenaline had burned away, leaving a profound, unbreakable resolve. The Preston family thought they were fighting a war of intimidation. They did not realize they were already standing on the gallows, and I had just secured the rope. The following week, the Preston family executed a desperate, calculated maneuver to mask their bleeding balance sheets. Richard liquidated a massive portion of his remaining personal assets to host the annual Preston Foundation Charity Gala. He rented the grand ballroom of the Drake Hotel, draped the tables in imported silk, and hired a string quartet that charged more per hour than a mid-level executive earned in a month. It was a staggering display of wealth designed entirely to project stability to the Chicago financial elite. The guest list was heavily curated to attract new venture capital and secure alternative credit lines. The primary objective, however, was to lure a representative from Kensington Holdings. Richard believed a public display of philanthropic power might convince the firm to renegotiate the looming $50 million debt. He failed to realize that Kensington Holdings was already inside the building. I stepped into the opulent ballroom holding Julian's arm. I wore a structured emerald gown that swept the marble floor. Julian stood beside me in a midnight blue tuxedo. He did not wear a designer label or a flashy watch. He exuded the quiet, understated elegance of a man who owned the building rather than a man trying to rent it for the night. Since Julian held a permanent seat on the Kensington Foundation board, our invitation bypassed Richard's screening process entirely. The atmosphere in the room was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low murmur of strategic networking. We moved past the ice sculptures and the towering floral arrangements, observing the desperate theater unfolding around us. It did not take long for the Preston family to spot the infiltration. Marcus broke away from a group of potential investors near the open bar. He moved through the crowd with an aggressive, purposeful stride. He wore a custom-tailored velvet jacket that screamed new money. His face tightened into a mask of arrogant disdain as he intercepted our path, deliberately blocking our access to the main dining area. "Well, this is an unexpected surprise," Marcus announced loudly. His voice projected clearly, designed to draw the attention of the affluent guests mingling nearby. Several heads turned toward our confrontation. Marcus looked Julian up and down, his eyes lingering on the unbranded tuxedo with theatrical pity. "I see you managed to find a suit for the occasion. Did Claire pawn her grandmother's jewelry to rent it for you? I thought Richard banned you from the estate, but I suppose leeches always find a way to crash the party where the real money flows." Julian did not flinch. He did not tighten his grip on my arm. He simply picked a flute of champagne from a passing waiter's tray and took a slow, measured sip. He looked at Marcus with the mild curiosity one might reserve for an overly aggressive street performer. "You are a bold man. Julian Marcus continued his tone, mocking and condescending. "To show your face here, living off the charity of a disgraced auditor. Are you hoping to network tonight? Perhaps beg for a junior analyst position at my firm? I am afraid my venture capital portfolio does not accommodate charity cases with imaginary leverage." A few polite chuckles rippled through the small audience gathering around us. Marcus thrived on an audience. He believed public humiliation was a demonstration of dominance. He believed he controlled the narrative. I released Julian's arm. I stepped forward, closing the distance between Marcus and myself. I did not raise my voice. I did not engage in his performative shouting match. I stepped directly into his personal space, forcing him to look down at me. I tilted my head, keeping my expression entirely neutral, and lowered my voice to a sharp, icy whisper meant only for his ears. "Apex Innovations," I murmured. Marcus's smug smile faltered instantly. The confident posture he projected to the room shattered. His eyes widened, darting nervously toward the investors standing a few feet away. "That was the name of the shell company in the Cayman Islands." I continued, my voice a lethal, quiet hum. $12 million, Marcus. That is the exact amount you hemorrhaged on that failed biometric startup last quarter. I know because I spent 4 nights restructuring the trust ledgers to hide that catastrophic loss from the SEC. I know you used Preston Realty Capital to cover the margin call. I know you forged Richard's signature on the authorization forms. Marcus went rigid. The blood drained from his face, leaving his complexion a dull, ashen gray. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words materialized. "The ghost ledger is no longer on the server, Marcus," I whispered, twisting the knife. "It is safely secured on a heavily encrypted cloud drive, waiting for an automated transmission to the federal authorities. The moment Julian's team initiates the default protocols on Richard's debt, I am sending that file to the fraud division. You are not a venture capitalist. You are a criminal waiting for an indictment. Enjoy the champagne. It might be your last vintage before the federal marshals arrive." I stepped back, allowing the ambient noise of the ballroom to rush back into the space between us. Marcus stared at me, his eyes wide with a frantic, unadulterated terror. The illusion of his success, the entire foundation of his elite persona, had just been obliterated with a single whispered number. The panic overwhelmed his carefully constructed facade. He lost his grip on the heavy crystal tumbler he held in his right hand. The glass slipped from his fingers and crashed onto the polished marble floor. The sharp, explosive sound of shattering crystal echoed sharply across the elegant ballroom. The string quartet faltered. The conversations abruptly ceased. Every eye in the vicinity locked onto Marcus, watching the sophisticated venture capitalist stand, paralyzed amidst a puddle of expensive bourbon and broken glass. Julian smoothly extended his arm to me. I placed my hand on his sleeve. We stepped around the growing pool of liquor and the shattered remains of Marcus's composure. We walked toward the center of the room, leaving the golden child's husband, trembling in the mess he created, while the whispers of the Chicago elite began to circulate like poison through the crowd. The digital clock on my kitchen counter displayed 2 a.m. The quiet sanctuary of my apartment offered a temporary shield from the chaos of the gala. I stood by the window watching the city lights reflect off the dark surface of the river. Julian sat on the sofa behind me, reviewing a series of emails on his phone. The silence shattered the moment my cell phone began to ring. The screen illuminated the dark countertop. The caller identification displayed my father's private office line. I picked up the device and pressed it to my ear. I did not offer a greeting. "You actually believed you could bluff me," Richard hissed through the speaker. His voice carried a frantic, unhinged energy, stripped of its usual polished arrogance. "I made a few phone calls, Claire. I ran a background check. Kensington Holdings employs over 5,000 people across the globe. Sharing a surname does not make your pathetic boyfriend a kingmaker." I leaned against the granite counter, listening to the depths of my father's delusion. Richard could not fathom that the man he insulted was the heir to a financial dynasty. His ego demanded a reality where he remained the smartest man in the room. He constructed a narrative that fit his narrow worldview. "He is an illegitimate nobody." Richard continued, his tone dripping with venomous triumph. "He is a glorified desk jockey given a low-level analyst job out of pity. Did you think parading a bastard child with a fancy last name would scare me into forgiving your insubordination? You have underestimated my resources for the last time." I let him speak. I allowed him to dig his own grave with every word. "What do you want, Richard?" "I want my company secured," he demanded. "And you are going to secure it." I spent the last 48 hours working with my legal team and my remaining accountants. We restructured the metadata on the offshore routing files. We altered the digital footprints. Every missing dollar Marcus squandered now points directly to your home network IP address. I have a sworn affidavit ready to submit to the Federal Bureau of Investigation framing you for corporate embezzlement. The documentation proves you siphoned $12 million from Preston Realty to fund a lavish lifestyle and support your freeloading boyfriend. The mechanics of his threat were ruthless. My father was willing to send his own daughter to federal prison to cover the tracks of a fraudulent son-in-law. He intended to serve me to the authorities on a silver platter to save his crumbling empire. "If you submit forged documents to federal agents, you will face perjury charges," I stated, keeping my voice dead flat. "It is your word against a unified corporate board," Richard fired back. "They will raid your home. They will freeze your assets permanently. They will lock you in a cell before you even get a chance to secure a defense attorney, unless you do exactly what I say." I traced the edge of the granite counter with my index finger. "Outline your terms. Tomorrow at noon, you will bring that boy to my corporate office," Richard ordered. "He will get on his knees and apologize to Marcus for the stunt at the gala. Then he is going to prove his worth. Since he works inside the Kensington network, he has access to their internal acquisition targets. I need capital, Claire. I need liquidity fast. Your boyfriend is going to leak Kensington's upcoming buyout targets to my private brokers. If I know which companies they plan to acquire before the market opens, I can leverage the margins and trade on the insider knowledge to clear my debts." Richard wanted to use Julian for insider trading. He wanted to hold the threat of federal prison over my head to force a hostage situation. He believed he could turn Kensington's wealth into his own personal bailout fund by extorting a man he assumed was a low-level employee. "You are building a house of cards on a foundation of gasoline," Richard III told him quietly. "I am not bringing Julian to your office. I am not facilitating your insider trading. And I am not afraid of your forged ledgers." I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the counter. Julian looked up from the sofa. He had heard enough of the conversation to grasp the situation. His expression hardened into a cold, lethal mask. He recognized the desperation in Richard's tactics. "He wants to use me to front-run my own firm's acquisitions," Julian said. His voice lacked any amusement. The sheer audacity of the demand offended him on a fundamental level. "He thinks he can hold an FBI investigation over your head to force compliance. He needs a hostage," I replied. "He needs to prove he controls the board." Before Julian could formulate a response, a heavy rhythmic pounding echoed through the apartment. The sound did not come from a polite visitor. It was the sharp, authoritative strike of law enforcement demanding entry. "Chicago Police Department," a gruff voice shouted through the heavy wood of my front door. "Open the door immediately." Julian stood up, his posture rigid. I raised a hand, signaling him to stay back. I walked to the entryway, unfastened the deadbolt, and pulled the door open. 3 uniformed officers and 1 plainclothes detective stood in the corridor. The detective held a folded document in his right hand. He did not ask for permission to enter. He stepped across the threshold, forcing me to step back into the living room. "Claire Preston," the detective asked, scanning the interior of my apartment. "I am Claire," I answered. The detective thrust the document toward my chest. "I am Detective Donovan with the Financial Crimes Unit. We have a warrant to search these premises and seize any digital hardware, physical ledgers, and external storage devices. This warrant is based on an anonymous tip corroborated by preliminary evidence provided by the legal counsel of Preston Realty. You are currently under investigation for corporate embezzlement and wire fraud. Step aside." Richard did not wait for my refusal. He had triggered the police raid the moment he hung up the phone. He wanted the authorities inside my home to prove the weight of his threat. He wanted me terrified. The officers bypassed me and flooded into the living room. They moved with disruptive efficiency. One officer headed straight for my home office setup. Another began pulling books off the shelves, searching for hidden safes or flash drives. A third officer moved into my bedroom, flipping the mattress and emptying the contents of my nightstand drawers onto the floor. I stood in the center of the room, watching strangers tear my sanctuary apart. I maintained a posture of total stillness. I did not shout. I did not demand to call a lawyer. I watched the officer in the study unplug my desktop computer and place it into a heavy evidence bag. I watched them confiscate a secondary laptop from my coffee table. I knew those devices held nothing of value. They were decoys. I kept them loaded with standard tax returns, public filings, and mundane spreadsheets. The ghost ledger remained encrypted on a secure cloud server tied to a dead man switch miles away from the physical hardware in my apartment. Richard's legal team would find nothing but sterile, useless data on those drives. But the physical violation of my space served its purpose. It escalated the conflict from a corporate dispute to a legal siege. Detective Donovan noticed Julian standing near the window. The detective stepped forward, attempting to assert dominance over the unknown man in the room. "Identify yourself," Donovan demanded. Julian met the detective's gaze with unwavering intensity. He did not offer his name. He did not hand over an identification card. Julian simply looked at the badge pinned to Donovan's belt, then back up to his eyes. "I am a guest in this home," Julian stated, his voice a low, resonant baritone. "And you are currently executing a search warrant based on falsified documents provided by a man desperate to cover his own federal crimes. I suggest you log every piece of hardware you take tonight with extreme precision. When the federal prosecutor reviews the chain of evidence, they will want to know exactly who authorized this waste of municipal resources." Donovan frowned, momentarily thrown by Julian's quiet authority. The detective opened his mouth to issue a warning, but the sheer confidence radiating from Julian shut the conversation down. Donovan turned away, signaling his officers to wrap up the search. They marched out of the apartment 15 minutes later, carrying 3 evidence bags filled with useless electronics. The heavy door clicked shut behind them, leaving a profound ringing silence in their wake. I surveyed the wreckage of my living room. Books lay scattered across the rug. Drawers hung open. The serene environment I built for myself had been trampled by my father's paranoia. Julian stepped up beside me. He looked at the overturned furniture, then turned his gaze to my face. "I wants a war," Julian said. I reached down and picked up a fallen picture frame from the rug. "No," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "He wants a hostage. He believes confiscating my hardware strips me of my leverage. He believes I have no choice but to surrender to his extortion tomorrow." I placed the frame back onto the shelf. I turned to look at Julian. "Tomorrow at noon, I am going to walk right into his trap, and I am going to hand him the rope he needs to hang himself." The sleek glass elevator ascended to the top floor of the Preston Realty headquarters. The ride was silent, smooth, and designed to inspire awe in anyone summoned to my father's domain. I carried a single thick leather portfolio under my arm. Inside sat a stack of printed spreadsheets, meaningless data disguised as vital ledgers. I wore a conservative gray suit and a delicate vintage brooch pinned near my collar. The brooch featured a cluster of small diamonds surrounding a dark sapphire center. The piece looked like a family heirloom. It was in reality a high-grade encrypted microphone transmitting a continuous live audio feed directly to the secure servers of Kensington Holdings' legal department. The elevator doors parted. I stepped out onto the plush carpet of the executive suite. The receptionist did not offer a greeting. She simply nodded toward the heavy double doors at the end of the corridor. I pushed the doors open and walked into the trap. The executive boardroom was a vast expanse of polished mahogany and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago skyline. Richard sat at the head of the long table. Diana stood behind his chair, her arms crossed over her chest. Jessica perched on the edge of the table, swinging her legs with a casual, predatory grace. They arranged themselves to project unified dominance. They wanted me to feel the crushing weight of their collective power. "Lock the door," Richard commanded. Jessica hopped off the table, strode over to the double doors, and turned the heavy deadbolt with a loud metallic clack. She turned around and flashed a triumphant, malicious smile. "Place your phone on the table and slide it across to me," Jessica ordered. She held out her hand, snapping her fingers impatiently. "We are not taking any chances with you recording this conversation." I reached into my pocket, retrieved my cell phone, and pushed it across the smooth surface of the conference table. Jessica snatched the device, powered it down, and shoved it into her designer handbag. She believed she had just neutralized my only line of defense. The sapphire brooch on my lapel blinked a microscopic invisible infrared signal, confirming the audio transmission remained active. Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows on the mahogany table. He looked at the leather portfolio tucked under my arm. He misinterpreted my calm demeanor for resignation. "I see the police visit last night clarified your understanding of the situation," Richard said. His voice carried the smug, heavy satisfaction of a dictator accepting a surrender. "You realize now that fighting me is a losing battle. The evidence is secured in police custody. The narrative is set. Your only path forward is absolute compliance." I placed the leather portfolio onto the table. I kept my hand resting on the cover, maintaining a posture of reluctant submission. "I want to understand the terms of this arrangement before I hand over the ledgers," I stated, keeping my voice slightly uneven, mimicking the tremor of a frightened hostage. "If I give you these files and if I agree to your demands regarding Julian, how do I know you will not submit the forged embezzlement affidavit to the FBI anyway?" Diana let out a sharp, dismissive laugh. She stepped out from behind Richard's chair and walked slowly down the length of the table toward me. "You do not dictate the terms," Claire Diana hissed. Her tone dripped with venomous superiority. "You are in no position to negotiate. You brought ruin to this family out of spite. You paraded that Kensington fraud around to humiliate your father. You owe us your obedience." I lowered my gaze, staring at the polished wood grain of the table. I needed them to feel invincible. I needed their arrogance to override their caution. "I just need a guarantee," I pleaded quietly. "If I sign a confession, you hold all the leverage. You could send me to prison the moment I stop being useful." Richard chuckled. It was a cold, humorless sound. He stood up from his chair and walked over to stand beside his wife. He looked down at me, relishing the perceived power dynamic. "That is exactly the point," Claire. Richard explained, his arrogance blinding him to the trap he was walking into. "We need a permanent insurance policy. Marcus made a few reckless investments. $12 million vanished. We needed to route that loss through the dummy corporation in the Caymans to protect the core assets of Preston Realty. It was a standard restructuring maneuver." He paused, admiring his own fraudulent genius. "But you decided to archive those transactions. You created a liability. The affidavit I drafted claims you initiated those wire transfers. It claims you set up the offshore accounts to fund your lifestyle. When you sign the confession today, acknowledging those specific crimes, I hold a loaded gun to your head for the rest of your natural life." I kept my head bowed, allowing the sapphire brooch to capture every damning syllable. My father just confessed to federal wire fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy to commit perjury on a live recorded transmission. The legal team at Kensington Holdings was currently logging his exact words into a sealed evidentiary file. "But Marcus forged your signature on the transfer authorizations," I murmured, feigning confusion. "How can you blame me for documents he signed?" Jessica scoffed from across the room. She walked over and stood uncomfortably close to my side. She wanted to physically dominate the space. "Do not play stupid." "Claire," Jessica sneered. "Marcus did what he had to do to protect our lifestyle. Dad authorized the signature. It was a calculated risk. And it worked perfectly until you decided to play the saintly auditor. We altered the metadata on the server logs last night. Every digital footprint now points directly to your login credentials. The police have the hard drives proving it." Jessica reached out and shoved my shoulder hard. The impact forced me to stumble slightly in my heels. "You are a pathetic, jealous little bitch," Jessica spat. She raised her hand and slapped the side of my head. The blow was not as forceful as Richard's strike, but it carried the same demeaning, humiliating intent. "You thought you could destroy my husband to make yourself feel important. Now you are going to spend the next 10 years covering our tracks, or you are going to spend them in a federal penitentiary." I steadied myself against the edge of the conference table. The physical assault, combined with her explicit admission of tampering with digital evidence and conspiring to frame me, provided the final nail in their coffin. Jessica had just implicated herself as an active participant in the fraud scheme. I looked up at my father, ensuring my expression conveyed total defeat. "And Julian?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "What do you want me to do about Julian?" Richard smiled, a predatory gleam in his eyes. He believed he had broken me completely. "Julian is your assignment," Richard commanded. "You will bring him here tomorrow. He will apologize to Marcus for the scene at the gala. Then you will leverage your relationship. He works inside the Kensington network. He has access to their confidential acquisition targets. You will coerce him into providing us with the names of the companies Kensington plans to buy out next quarter. I will trade on that insider knowledge to clear the $50 million debt. You will use him, Claire, just like we are using you." I nodded slowly, absorbing the sheer magnitude of his criminal intent. He confessed to extortion, insider trading, conspiracy, and blackmail. The audio file currently uploading to the Kensington servers was a masterpiece of self-incrimination. I slid the leather portfolio across the table toward Richard. "Here are the printed ledgers," I said softly. "Everything you need is inside." Richard eagerly grabbed the portfolio and flipped it open. His eyes scanned the top spreadsheet. The triumphant smile vanished from his face, replaced instantly by a deep, furious confusion. He flipped to the next page, then the next. "These are just standard public tax filings," Richard growled, his voice rising in pitch. "Where is the ghost ledger? Where are the offshore routing numbers?" I stood up straight, abandoning the posture of a frightened hostage. I rolled my shoulders back and met my father's furious gaze with a look of absolute icy calm. "The ghost ledger was never on those hard drives," Richard stated clearly. "The police seized empty hardware. The actual evidence is currently sitting on a heavily encrypted server monitored by an independent cybersecurity firm." Diana slammed her hand onto the table. "Then you will give us the access codes right now. You are not leaving this room until you do." I reached up and lightly tapped the sapphire brooch on my lapel. "I do not need to give you the access codes, Diana," I replied, my voice projecting crisp and unyielding across the boardroom. "Because the legal team at Kensington Holdings is already reviewing the files. They are also reviewing the live audio transmission of this entire conversation." The color drained from Richard's face. He stared at the small piece of vintage jewelry pinned to my suit. The reality of his catastrophic error crashed down upon him. He had just confessed to a litany of federal crimes on a live microphone monitored by the most powerful financial institution in the country. Jessica gasped, stepping back away from me, as if the brooch were a live explosive. "You recorded us," Jessica shrieked. Her voice hit a panicked, hysterical register. "You recorded yourselves," I corrected her. "I simply provided the microphone. The confession is legally binding, the extortion is documented, and your plan to utilize Julian for insider trading is now evidence in a federal investigation." Richard lunged forward across the table, his face contorted in a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "Give me that device!" he roared, his massive hands grasping for my collar. I stepped back, avoiding his clumsy grasp, but the fragile illusion of control in the boardroom had shattered completely. The trap was sprung, and the predators had just realized they were the prey. I stepped backward, keeping a calculated distance between my father and myself. Richard stood frozen, his chest heaving, as the reality of his own recorded confession echoed in his mind. He had just handed the federal authorities every piece of evidence they needed to dismantle his entire real estate portfolio. I kept my eyes locked on him, my posture projecting an unyielding calm. I reached for the handle of the heavy boardroom door, ready to leave them in the wreckage of their own making. Before my fingers could turn the brass knob, Jessica lunged. My sister had been staring at the vintage sapphire brooch pinned to my collar. She processed the blinking infrared light hidden within the diamond cluster. She understood that the tiny piece of jewelry was the exact instrument executing her financial ruin. Jessica saw her designer wardrobe, her luxury vehicles, and her exclusive country club memberships evaporating into thin air. The entitlement she relied on her entire life shattered, leaving behind nothing but the frantic, raw panic of a cornered animal. "Give it to me!" Jessica shrieked. She hurled her body across the polished mahogany table, ignoring the scattered documents and overturned chairs. She collided with my chest, her manicured fingers clawing frantically at the fabric of my gray suit. I stumbled backward against the wood paneling of the wall, the impact knocking the breath from my lungs. I immediately brought my hands up, shielding the brooch. I clamped my fingers over the device, refusing to let her pry it from my lapel. Jessica screamed a high, piercing sound stripped of all her usual societal refinement. She dug her nails into my wrists, tearing at my skin. Sharp lines of stinging pain flared across my forearms, but I held my grip firm. "Take it off her!" Diana yelled from the opposite side of the room, her voice bordering on hysteria. "Get that transmitter right now!" Jessica grabbed the lapel of my blazer and yanked backward with all her strength. The seam of my jacket ripped the fabric, tearing with a loud, distinct sound. I shifted my weight, driving my elbow upward to break her hold. Jessica lost her balance, her high heels slipping on the plush carpet, but she refused to let go. She twisted her hands into my shirt collar, choking off my air supply. I pushed forward, driving her back toward the conference table. We struggled in the center of the boardroom. The illusion of the Preston family prestige dissolved into a chaotic, primitive brawl. Richard scrambled toward the heavy double doors. He frantically twisted the deadbolt, throwing the doors open. Marcus Richards shouted into the executive corridor, "Get in here now!" Footsteps pounded against the carpet outside. Marcus stormed into the boardroom. He took one look at his wife grappling with me and assessed the immediate threat. He knew his venture capital firm, his forged returns, and his freedom relied entirely on destroying the evidence I carried. Marcus did not hesitate. He crossed the room in 3 long strides. He used his broad athletic frame to forcefully separate Jessica from my body. He did not step in to break up the fight. He stepped in to finish it. Marcus grabbed my shoulders and slammed me hard against the edge of the conference table. The sharp corner bit deep into my lower back. I gasped, the sudden pain radiating down my spine. Marcus reached out his large hands, clamping over my wrists. He twisted my arms backward with clinical precision, forcing a jolt of searing pain through my shoulder joints. "Hold her down!" Richard barked, his face flushed a dark, furious red. "Rip that thing off her chest and smash it." Marcus leaned his body weight into me, pinning me securely against the mahogany surface. His face hovered inches from mine, his jaw clenched tightly. "You think you are smart?" Claire Marcus hissed through his teeth. "You think you can burn my career to the ground and just walk out of this building? You are leaving in handcuffs." I gritted my teeth against the mounting pain in my shoulders. I stared directly into Marcus's eyes, refusing to flinch, refusing to offer them the satisfaction of my fear. "The audio file finished uploading 3 minutes ago, Marcus." I managed to say, my breath coming in shallow gasps. "Breaking the hardware changes nothing. The legal team at Kensington Holdings already possesses your confession. You are just adding physical assault to your federal indictment." Marcus's expression faltered. A flicker of genuine dread crossed his features. He realized the futility of his actions, but his panic overrode his logic. He raised his hand, reaching directly for the sapphire brooch pinned to my torn collar. He intended to tear the fabric straight from my chest. A deafening, explosive crash stopped him cold. The thick, frosted glass panel bordering the boardroom doors shattered inward. A cascade of sharp, glittering fragments rained down onto the carpet. Before Richard could even turn to face the noise, 3 men dressed in tactical black suits surged through the destroyed entryway. They did not wear badges. They did not shout commands. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized efficiency that bespoke elite private military training. The lead security operative crossed the room in a blur of motion. He did not negotiate. He seized Marcus by the collar of his custom-tailored jacket and swept his leg out from under him. Marcus hit the floor hard. The breath rushed out of his lungs in a sharp grunt. 2 operatives instantly descended upon him, pinning his arms behind his back and driving his cheek directly into the carpet. The wealthy, untouchable venture capitalist found himself immobilized, his expensive suit covered in shards of broken glass, his dignity entirely erased. Jessica screamed and scrambled backward, pressing herself against the far wall. Diana covered her mouth, her eyes wide with terror, while Richard stood frozen near the head of the table. Julian stepped through the shattered doorway. He moved with an eerie, unhurried calm. He wore a dark, bespoke suit that absorbed the light in the room. He did not look at Richard. He did not spare a single glance for Diana or the struggling Marcus on the floor. His eyes locked onto me. Julian walked across the glass-strewn carpet. He extended his hand. I placed my trembling fingers into his palm. He pulled me up from the edge of the conference table, his grip steady and warm. He carefully assessed my torn blazer, the red scratch marks bleeding on my wrists, and the disheveled state of my hair. His jaw tightened, a subtle shift that radiated a dangerous, lethal intent. "Are you injured?" Julian asked, his voice low and devoid of any emotional fluctuation. "I am intact," I replied, straightening my posture and brushing a piece of shattered glass from my sleeve. Julian finally turned his attention to the man standing at the head of the table. Richard tried to muster a facade of authority, but his hands trembled visibly at his sides. "What is the meaning of this?" Richard stammered, attempting to project outrage. "You cannot storm into my corporate headquarters. I will have you arrested for breaking and entering." I will sue Kensington Holdings for corporate espionage and assault." Julian looked at my father the way a scientist observes a dying organism under a microscope. He did not raise his voice. He did not offer a threat. He delivered a factual, undeniable truth. "You just signed your family's death warrant," Julian stated. His tone was as cold and hard as a steel blade. Richard opened his mouth desperately, searching for a rebuttal, but the sheer gravity of Julian's presence silenced him. The security operatives hauled Marcus up from the floor, keeping his arms locked firmly behind his back. Marcus struggled, his face twisted in humiliation, but the guards held him with effortless strength. "Release him," Julian commanded the operatives. The guards shoved Marcus forward. He stumbled, barely catching his balance at the conference table. He adjusted his ruined jacket, his chest heaving, refusing to make eye contact with anyone in the room. Julian placed his hand on the small of my back, guiding me toward the ruined doorway. We did not wait for a response. We did not offer a parting insult. The silence we left in our wake was far more devastating than any shouted argument. We stepped out into the executive corridor, the crunch of broken glass echoing beneath our shoes. Behind us, the boardroom descended into frantic, delusional chaos. "Call the legal team right now!" Richard yelled, his voice carrying through the shattered doorway. "I want a restraining order filed. I want a gag order on that recording. They cannot use illegally obtained audio. We are going to spin this. We will say she attempted to extort us. Marcus, call your investors. Tell them we are restructuring. Diana, get my public relations manager on the line." I listened to my father barking orders, clinging to the dying embers of his empire. He truly believed his lawyers could outmaneuver the legal juggernaut of Kensington Holdings. He believed his money could buy a shield against his own recorded confession. He remained entirely trapped in his own hubris, unable to comprehend that the board was already swept clean. Julian pressed the elevator button. The doors slid open, revealing the polished interior. We stepped inside, and the doors glided shut, cutting off the frantic sounds of the Preston family grasping at shadows. I stood next to Julian, looking at my reflection in the mirrored doors. My suit was torn, my wrists stung, but I had never felt more powerful in my entire life. A dense, suffocating paranoia gripped the Preston estate over the next 30 days. While I watched the legal machinery of Kensington Holdings methodically lock down my father's assets, Richard engaged in a frantic, delusional performance of invincibility. Preston Realty faced a catastrophic liquidity crisis. The margin calls initiated by Julian's financial team had decimated their offshore accounts. Marcus's venture capital coalition fractured as nervous investors quietly pulled their backing after catching wind of the looming federal probe. The walls were closing in, yet my family refused to acknowledge the tightening noose. Instead of preparing for bankruptcy, Richard doubled down on the illusion. He announced the Preston Realty 35th Anniversary Gala. The event was engineered to be a spectacular display of enduring corporate power. Richard booked the grand ballroom of the Palmer House, intending to invite every major real estate developer, political ally, and financial backer in the Midwest. The strategy was transparent. He aimed to project such overwhelming wealth and stability that his panicked creditors might hesitate to recall their loans. He believed a single night of lavish indulgence could mask 30 days of financial hemorrhage. It was the desperate, reckless gamble of a man who preferred to drown in champagne rather than admit he was sinking. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, a courier arrived at my apartment building. I sat at my kitchen island reviewing the final draft of the asset forfeiture documents with Julian. The doorbell chimed sharply. I opened the door to find a delivery agent holding an oversized cream-colored envelope sealed with the Preston family crest in heavy gold wax. I signed for the parcel, returned to the kitchen, and broke the seal. Inside sat a formal invitation to the Anniversary Gala. The cardstock was thick and edged in gold foil. The cursive font announced the celebration of 35 years of industry leadership, but the invitation was not addressed to me as a guest. I pulled out a secondary typed letter folded neatly behind the invitation. The document bore the official letterhead of my mother's private event management company. Diana handled all the social mechanics for the family business. I read the brief, sterile paragraphs. My parents were not inviting me to celebrate. They were conscripting me. Diana's letter designated me as the lead event coordinator for the evening. The instructions were explicit. I was required to manage the catering staff, oversee the floral arrangements, and ensure the seamless execution of the VIP reception hour. They expected me to wear a standard black service uniform and remain strictly behind the scenes. The audacity was staggering, but the final paragraph of the letter revealed the true nature of their desperation. Richard offered a conditional truce. Diana wrote that if I successfully managed the logistics of the event, and if I utilized my connection with Julian to secure the attendance of a senior executive from Kensington Holdings, Preston Realty would officially withdraw the corporate espionage complaint currently pending with the FBI. My parents believed the federal investigation still held leverage. They assumed the silence from the authorities over the past month meant their forged evidence was slowly winding its way through the bureaucratic pipeline. They had no idea the FBI was currently using their forged documents to build a massive racketeering case against them, aided entirely by the audio confession I provided. They thought they were offering me a lifeline. In reality, they were offering me a mop and a bucket to clean the deck of the Titanic while it slipped beneath the waves. I handed the letter across the granite countertop to Julian. He read the terms of their extortion. A slow, chilling smile touched the corners of his mouth. Julian rarely smiled, and when he did, it usually signaled that someone was about to lose a significant amount of money. He set the letter down and looked at me. His eyes held a dark, predatory gleam. "They want you to coordinate the catering," Julian noted, his voice smooth and detached. "And they want me to deliver a Kensington executive to legitimize their charade." I picked up the invitation, tracing the gold-embossed lettering with my thumb. "They are terrified, Julian. They need the market to see that Kensington Holdings is not actively hostile toward them. If a senior executive shows up, Richard can imply a strategic partnership is in the works. It might buy him 30 days of grace from his creditors. He thinks I am desperate enough to avoid a fake prison sentence that I will force you to play the role of the useful low-level liaison." Julian leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. He assessed the tactical landscape of the upcoming gala. His mind processed the variables, the vulnerabilities, and the opportunity for maximum psychological devastation. "He wants a Kensington executive," Julian stated quietly. "He wants the validation of the firm he insulted." I looked at him, recognizing the shift in his strategy. "What are you thinking?" "I think we should give him exactly what he asked for," Julian replied. His tone lacked any trace of mercy. "We accept the invitation. You put on the uniform. You coordinate their event. You let Diana treat you like the help. You let Jessica and Marcus parade their imagined victory in front of the Chicago elite. We let them build the stage, wire the lighting, and gather the audience." Julian leaned forward, resting his hands on the countertop. "And then at exactly 8 o'clock, when Richard takes the podium to declare his empire invincible, I am going to deliver the most senior executive Kensington Holdings has to offer. We are going to turn his 35th anniversary into his professional execution." A profound, electrifying calm settled over me. The anxiety, the lingering sting of the physical assault, the years of quiet subjugation, it all evaporated, replaced by the sheer, undeniable clarity of the impending checkmate. I did not want a quiet legal victory settled behind closed doors in a sterile mediation room. I wanted the elite social circle that Richard worshipped to witness his total eradication. I wanted the investors he lied to, the politicians he bribed, and the rivals he crushed to watch him lose everything on his own stage. I pulled my laptop closer and opened my email client. I drafted a brief formal response to Diana's event management company. I confirmed receipt of the instructions. I agreed to the uniform requirements. I confirmed that I would manage the service logistics for the duration of the evening. I typed the final sentence with meticulous care. "I have spoken with my contact regarding your request. A senior representative from Kensington Holdings will be in attendance." I hit send. The trap was officially set. My family believed they had successfully forced me back into submission. They believed they had weaponized my fear to secure their salvation. They spent the next 30 days finalizing the floral arrangements, polishing their jewelry, and drafting speeches about legacy and resilience. They had no idea they were meticulously planning their own funeral. I spent the next 30 days finalizing the asset transfer protocols. Julian and his legal team quietly moved the financial guillotine into position. We synchronized the execution of the default notices to coincide exactly with the gala's keynote address. The Preston family prepared for a celebration. We prepared for a slaughter. The Palmer House Grand Ballroom hummed with the manufactured energy of a corporate triumph. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the imported orchids and polished silver centerpieces. 300 of Chicago's most influential figures filled the space, a sea of bespoke tuxedos and designer evening gowns. State senators, real estate moguls, and managing partners from major law firms mingled near the open bars, sipping top-tier vintage champagne. The Preston family spared no expense to project an aura of unshakable prosperity. I stood in the shadows of the service corridor, separated from the glittering elite by a set of heavy swinging doors. I wore the standard event staff uniform: black slacks, a crisp black button-down shirt, and a dark apron tied securely at my waist. I held a digital tablet tracking the catering schedule, but my primary focus remained fixed on the small countdown timer, blinking steadily in the corner of the screen. The time read 7:15, 45 minutes until the financial detonation. My mother Diana treated the ballroom like her personal kingdom. She glided between clusters of affluent guests, her smile radiant, her posture immaculate. She projected the image of a matriarch securing her family's legacy. Every 10 minutes, she would retreat toward the service doors, dropping the facade the moment she crossed the threshold into my workspace. Claire, table 4 needs more ice, and the past hors d'oeuvres are circulating too slowly. Diana snapped, her voice stripped of its prior warmth. She adjusted the heavy diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. The mayor's wife is looking for a specific sparkling water. Find it. Do not just stand there holding that tablet. You are here to work. Prove you can be useful for once in your life. I did not argue. I nodded, once my expression perfectly blank, and relayed the instructions to the catering captain through my headset. I moved back out onto the perimeter of the ballroom floor, seamlessly blending in with the waitstaff. I carried a silver tray of empty glasses, keeping a low profile, ensuring the machinery of the event ran flawlessly. Jessica intercepted me near the main bar. My sister wore a scarlet evening gown that demanded attention. She clung tightly to Marcus's arm, projecting the image of a powerful, unified power couple. They both knew the federal authorities were circling their accounts, but their arrogance allowed them to believe this gala would magically erase their criminal liability. Jessica stepped directly into my path, forcing me to halt abruptly to avoid dropping the tray. "Well, look who finally found a career that suits her." Jessica sneered, her voice carrying clearly over the ambient noise of the party. "The black uniform is very flattering, Claire. It hides the desperation quite well." Marcus let out a low, rumbling laugh. He held a crystal tumbler of scotch. He looked at me with the predatory satisfaction of a man who believed he had successfully crushed a rebellion. "I hear your little boyfriend managed to secure a +1 for a mid-level manager at Kensington tonight," Marcus remarked, his tone dripping with condescension. "Tell him I appreciate the effort. When Richard finishes his keynote speech, maybe I will offer the guy a job in our mailroom as a thank you, assuming you can convince him to accept minimum wage." I kept my gaze fixed on the wall behind them. I did not engage. I held the silver tray steady. Jessica noticed my stoic silence. My lack of reaction infuriated her. She wanted me to cry. She wanted me to lash out and cause a scene so she could have security drag me out the back door in disgrace. She needed to break my composure to validate her own fragile superiority. Jessica took a step closer. She deliberately shifted her weight, bumping her hips sharply against the edge of my silver tray. The sudden jolt threw me off balance. "Oh, excuse me," Jessica feigned surprise. She simultaneously tipped her own glass of red wine forward. The dark liquid splashed heavily onto the toe of my black service shoe and splattered across the hem of my slacks. A sharp, collective intake of breath echoed from a nearby group of investors. Several guests turned to witness the exchange. The humiliation was public, calculated, and vicious. Marcus did not apologize on his wife's behalf. He leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. He snapped his fingers directly in front of my face, a sharp, degrading sound meant for a disobedient animal. "You spilled on the marble," Claire Marcus commanded, pointing to the red drops staining the polished floor. "Get some napkins and clean it up before one of the actual guests slips. Get on your knees and wipe it up. Now." The surrounding guests fell silent. The cruelty was palpable. A few people looked away in discomfort, but no one intervened. They were guests of the Preston family. They operated by the unwritten rules of wealth. You do not correct the host in their own ballroom. I looked down at the wine staining my shoe. I felt the familiar burning surge of adrenaline, the primal instinct to fight back. I clamped down on it with absolute ruthless control. I remembered the encrypted audio file resting on the Kensington servers. I remembered the default notices queued in the digital pipeline. I knew that every second of compliance brought me closer to their total eradication. I set the silver tray down on a nearby cocktail table. I reached into the pocket of my apron and pulled out a stack of heavy white napkins. I did not glare at Marcus. I did not curse at Jessica. I slowly, deliberately lowered myself onto one knee. I pressed the napkins against the spilled wine on the marble floor. I wiped the surface clean. I absorbed the degradation, letting it fuel the cold, mechanical precision of my actions. I stood back up, discarded the soiled napkins onto the tray, and picked it up again. I met Marcus's eyes. The smug satisfaction on his face was already beginning to curdle into unease. He expected a fight. My absolute obedience unnerved him. It felt wrong. It felt dangerous. The stain is clear. I stated my voice, a quiet, emotionless void. Enjoy your evening. I turned and walked back toward the service doors. I felt their eyes burning into my back, but the sensation meant nothing. I pushed through the doors and checked the tablet in my hand. 7:55. 5 minutes remaining. I moved to my designated position near the main entrance of the ballroom, standing silently behind a large floral arrangement. I watched Richard ascend the steps to the main stage. The string quartet faded into silence. The lighting dimmed, focusing a bright spotlight on my father. He approached the podium, adjusting his tuxedo jacket, projecting the ultimate image of a victorious patriarch. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Richard's voice echoed through the state-of-the-art sound system. 35 years ago, Preston Realty started as a vision built on resilience, on family, and on the unwavering trust of our partners. He paused, scanning the crowd, soaking in the polite applause. He was performing for his life, desperate to convince the room that his empire stood on solid ground. I looked down at my tablet. 7:59. I glanced toward the heavy gilded doors at the main entrance of the ballroom. The security personnel flanking the doors suddenly straightened their posture. A subtle, urgent communication passed through their earpieces. Richard continued his speech, unaware of the shift in the atmosphere at the back of the room. "We face challenges, yes. The market shifts. But the Preston family does not retreat. We adapt. We conquer. And tonight we look toward a future of unprecedented expansion, supported by new alliances that will cement our legacy for generations to come." He was laying the groundwork. He was preparing to announce the presence of the Kensington executive, intending to spin the attendance into a false narrative of corporate partnership. The countdown timer on my tablet hit 0. 8 o'clock. The heavy gilded doors at the main entrance did not simply open. They were pushed wide by a team of severe-looking men in sharp, dark suits. The motion was forceful enough that the brass handles clanged loudly against the interior walls. The sudden noise severed Richard's speech mid-sentence. The entire ballroom turned their heads toward the back entrance. The atmosphere in the room did not just shift. It froze. The ambient warmth of the celebration evaporated instantly, replaced by a dense electric tension. The VIP guest Richard Preston had been praying for had finally arrived, but he had not come to celebrate. He had come to collect. The heavy brass doors of the Palmer House ballroom did not merely open. They swung inward with a forceful, defining thud that severed the ambient noise of the gala in half. The impact echoed across the vaulted ceiling, instantly silencing the murmured conversations of Chicago's financial elite. Hundreds of guests turned their heads in unison. The clinking of crystal champagne flutes ceased. The atmosphere in the room shifted from celebratory warmth to a sudden electric chill. Victor Kensington Sr. stepped across the threshold. He did not walk into the room so much as he claimed it. The billionaire titan of Wall Street possessed a physical presence that seemed to absorb the oxygen from the surrounding air. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that draped flawlessly over his broad shoulders. His silver hair caught the light of the chandeliers, and his sharp, calculating eyes scanned the crowd with the detached precision of a predator surveying a penned flock. He did not arrive alone. A phalanx of 6 corporate attorneys trailed a step behind him, moving in a tight, synchronized formation. They did not wear the festive attire of gala attendees. They wore severe dark suits and carried heavy leather briefcases. They looked like an execution squad stepping onto a battlefield. On the main stage, Richard froze behind the mahogany podium. His mid-sentence declaration about corporate resilience died in his throat. For a fraction of a second, raw confusion flashed across his face. Then a frantic, desperate calculation took over. Richard saw the legendary investor standing at the back of his ballroom. His narcissistic delusion shielded him from the obvious danger. He genuinely believed his lavish display of wealth had worked. He believed Victor Kensington Sr. had arrived to bless his crumbling empire with a strategic partnership. Richard abandoned the microphone. He practically sprinted down the velvet-carpeted steps of the stage, his polished dress shoes slipping slightly in his haste. He smoothed the lapels of his tuxedo, forcing a wide, manic smile onto his sweating face. He pushed past a group of powerful state senators eager to reach the back of the room before the Titan could change his mind. "Victor, what an unexpected honor," Richard announced. He projected his voice loudly, ensuring every affluent investor in the vicinity witnessed his familiarity with the legendary billionaire. Richard closed the distance and thrust his right hand forward, offering a vigorous, obsequious handshake. He leaned in, bowing his shoulders slightly, a physical manifestation of his sycophantic desperation. Victor Kensington Sr. did not slow his stride. He did not extend his own hand. He did not even turn his head to acknowledge the man standing in his path. The billionaire treated Richard like a piece of insignificant furniture, blocking his trajectory. Victor simply kept walking, forcing Richard to stumble awkwardly to the side to avoid a physical collision. The trailing attorneys mirrored the movement, bypassing the Preston patriarch without a single glance. Richard stood frozen in the center of the aisle. His extended hand hovered in the empty air, grasping at nothing. A quiet, collective gasp rippled through the surrounding crowd. The Chicago elite operated on strict social codes, and they had just witnessed a brutal, undeniable public emasculation. The whispers ignited instantly. Richard slowly lowered his hand, his forced smile cracking his face, flushing a deep, humiliated red. Victor continued his purposeful march down the center of the ballroom. The crowd parted instinctively, stepping back to clear a path for the Kensington delegation. Diana stood near the main bar, her crystal wineglass suspended halfway to her lips. The color drained from her cheeks as she watched the Titan ignore her husband. Jessica and Marcus stood a few feet away. Marcus recognized the severe demeanor of the legal team trailing behind the billionaire. Marcus understood the mechanics of corporate warfare. He knew those briefcases held injunctions, not investment portfolios. The arrogant smirk vanished from his face, replaced by a sudden creeping dread. Victor did not stop at the VIP tables. He bypassed the open bars and the towering floral arrangements. He maintained a direct, unwavering path toward the dim service corridor at the far edge of the room. He walked straight toward me. I stood near the swinging kitchen doors, dressed in the standard black catering uniform. My apron hung around my waist. The dark red wine stain from Jessica's intentional spill still marked the fabric of my slacks and the toe of my service shoe. I held a damp white cleaning cloth in my right hand. I kept my posture rigid and my chin lifted, refusing to shrink into the shadows. The entire ballroom held its breath. 300 guests turned their collective gaze toward the back corner of the room, watching the wealthiest man in the building approach a low-level event coordinator. Victor stopped 18 inches away from me. He ignored the catering captain hovering nervously nearby. He ignored the security guard standing at attention. He looked down at my uniform. His sharp eyes traced the wine stain on my slacks. He noted the damp cleaning rag gripped in my hand. His jaw tightened, a subtle shift that radiated a quiet, terrifying fury. He recognized the indignity forced upon me, and he despised the people responsible for it. Then the ruthless Titan of finance did something that shattered the comprehension of every guest in the room. Victor Kensington Sr. reached out and wrapped his arms around me in a firm, protective embrace. He pulled me close, offering a gesture of profound, undeniable paternal affection. The warmth of his embrace contrasted sharply with the cold, sterile environment of the Preston family gala. He stepped back, resting his heavy, reassuring hands on my shoulders. He turned his head slightly, projecting his voice to ensure the acoustics of the silent ballroom carried every single syllable to the far end of the stage. "Daughter, you do not need to clean up their trash anymore," Victor stated. The word struck the room like a physical blow. "Daughter." The syllable echoed off the crystal chandeliers and the marble columns. It hung in the air, shifting the entire power dynamic of the evening on its axis. Richard heard the word from his isolated spot in the center aisle. His brain seemingly short-circuited. He stared at me, the child he deemed a disposable disappointment, the daughter he banished to the service corridor. He watched the apex predator of Wall Street claim me as his own blood. The realization hit Richard with the force of a freight train. The leverage he thought he held, the federal extortion plot he devised, the entire foundation of his survival strategy, disintegrated into dust. Diana swayed on her feet. She reached out and gripped the edge of a cocktail table to keep her knees from buckling. The matriarch who spent her life cultivating an image of superior breeding now realized she had spent the entire evening treating a Kensington heir like a common servant. Her social standing evaporated in front of the very people she sought to impress. Jessica's face contorted into a mask of raw, unfiltered disbelief. She looked at her husband. Marcus stood paralyzed, his eyes wide with a frantic, suffocating terror. The $12 million fraud, the forged ledgers, the physical assault in the boardroom, it all rushed back to him. He realized he had not just attacked a rogue auditor. He had assaulted a member of the Kensington dynasty. The Preston family stood trapped in the wreckage of their own narrative. The story they built for 30 years shattered beyond repair. Before the room could even process the magnitude of Victor's declaration, the heavy doors at the main entrance opened wider. Julian stepped into the light. He no longer wore the faded linen jacket or the scuffed boots that Richard had mocked in the dining room weeks prior. Julian wore a bespoke midnight black suit, tailored with razor-sharp precision. He wore the armor of his true identity. He radiated a lethal, unyielding authority that commanded instant submission. Julian walked down the center aisle with the terrifying, deliberate grace of a predator closing in on its trapped prey. He did not spare a glance for Richard, who stood trembling near the stage. He ignored Marcus and Jessica, shrinking back into the crowd. Julian kept his eyes locked on me. He reached the back of the room and took his rightful place beside his father. He stood shoulder to shoulder with Victor, forming a solid, impenetrable wall of wealth and power around the girl the Prestons tried to discard. Julian reached out and took my hand, lacing his fingers through mine. The contrast was stark and deliberate. The immaculate heir to a global conglomerate holding the hand of a woman in a stained catering uniform. The trap was permanently sealed. The Kensington dynasty had positioned their forces. The Chicago elite watched in stunned silence as the ultimate power shift materialized right before their eyes. Richard Preston built a stage to announce his triumphant survival. Instead, he provided the perfect venue for his own public execution. The deafening silence in the ballroom stretched until it felt brittle enough to snap. The elite crowd remained paralyzed, captivated by the surreal tableau unfolding near the service corridor. Victor Kensington Sr. kept his protective stance beside me. Julian held my hand, his grip warm and resolute against the cold reality of the room. We stood united, a silent, immovable force facing down the crumbling facade of the Preston family. Richard possessed a dangerous kind of delusion, the kind that fueled a desperate man to ignore a burning house and insist on rearranging the furniture. He saw his entire world shifting. He saw the titan of Wall Street reject his handshake and claim his outcast daughter. The rational response would be to retreat, to call a lawyer, to quietly exit the stage before the situation escalated further. But Richard's narcissism overrode his survival instinct. He operated on the belief that if he projected enough authority, reality would eventually bend to his will. He believed the microphone was his ultimate weapon. He turned away from the tense scene at the back of the room and trudged back toward the stage. His steps lacked their usual commanding stride. He moved like a man walking through deep mud, but he kept moving. He climbed the velvet steps and grasped the edges of the mahogany podium. His knuckles turned white from the strain. The spotlight hit his face, highlighting a thin sheen of sweat on his forehead. The room reluctantly dragged its attention back to the host. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, his voice trembling before he forced it into a steady, booming cadence. "We gather tonight to celebrate a legacy, a 35-year legacy built on the bedrock of unshakable family values. Through shifting markets and unforeseen challenges, Preston Realty has endured because we rely on the strength of our bloodlines. We protect our own, and we stand united against those who seek to destabilize the foundation we have painstakingly built." He attempted to weave a narrative of resilience. He tried to frame the tension in the room as an external attack, hoping the affluent crowd would rally behind a besieged patriarch. It was a pathetic, transparent performance. I did not let him finish the paragraph. I released Julian's hand. I stepped away from the protective shadow of the Kensington patriarchs. I walked past the shocked catering captain and the frozen security guards. I moved down the center aisle, my black service uniform standing out starkly against the sea of designer gowns and bespoke tuxedos. My wine-stained shoe hit the polished floor with a deliberate, rhythmic click. I reached the front of the ballroom and bypassed the velvet stairs entirely. I vaulted onto the edge of the stage, my sudden movement startling the audio technician stationed near the speaker monitors. The technician, a young man clutching a clipboard, stared at me in confusion. I stepped smoothly into his workspace. I did not ask for permission. I reached forward and pulled the primary wireless microphone directly from his hands. I then bypassed his soundboard and plugged a small encrypted thumb drive directly into the master projection terminal connected to the twin digital screens flanking the stage. I walked to the center of the platform, stopping 5 feet from the podium where my father stood. Richard stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He glanced frantically toward the exit, expecting his private security team to rush the stage and remove me. The security team did not move. Julian had already replaced the perimeter guards with Kensington operatives during the initial chaos. Richard was entirely alone on his own stage. "Family and legacy," I repeated into the microphone. My voice did not tremble. It projected through the massive speaker system, sharp, crystalline, and utterly devoid of mercy. "Is that the foundation you want to celebrate tonight, Richard?" I turned my back to him and faced the 300 silent guests. I located Diana in the crowd, her face a mask of horrified realization. I found Jessica and Marcus shrinking back toward the exit doors. I wanted them all to have a clear view. I tapped the remote clicker in my hand. The twin screens flanking the stage flickered to life. The glowing Preston Realty logo vanished, replaced instantly by high-resolution scans of internal banking documents. The font was large enough for the guests in the back row to read clearly. The documents displayed routing numbers, authorized signatures, and time-stamped transfer logs. "Let us examine the legacy of Preston Realty," I announced. "This is a wire transfer authorization dated 14 months ago. It details the movement of $12 million from the firm's primary operational account to a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands known as Apex Innovations." A murmur of genuine shock rippled through the audience. These were seasoned financial professionals. They recognized the structure of a money laundering operation immediately. I clicked to the next slide. A massive, enlarged signature appeared on the screen. It was Marcus's signature, undeniably clear, authorizing the illicit transfer. My brother-in-law Marcus utilized those funds to cover a catastrophic margin call resulting from his gross negligence as a venture capitalist, I explained. He depleted the pensions and operational capital of Preston Realty investors to hide his personal failures. He then attempted to bury the transaction within a routine tax filing. I pointed to the screens, letting the evidence linger for a devastating moment. "But hiding stolen millions requires a scapegoat," I continued. "And a family built on such strong values naturally turns to its own blood to take the fall." I clicked the remote a third time. The screens transitioned from financial documents to a stark black audio interface. A play button hovered in the center of the display. The elite crowd leaned forward, mesmerized by the unfolding corporate execution. The hushed whispers died completely. The room felt vacuum-sealed. I pressed play. The pristine acoustics of the Palmer House ballroom broadcasted the recording from the sapphire brooch. The audio quality was flawless. Richard's recorded voice boomed through the speakers. "We altered the metadata on the offshore routing files. We altered the digital footprints. Every missing dollar Marcus squandered now points directly to your home network IP address. I have a sworn affidavit ready to submit to the Federal Bureau of Investigation framing you for corporate embezzlement." The collective gasp from the audience was audible. Several prominent investors actively recoiled, physically distancing themselves from the Preston family members standing nearby in the crowd. The sheer malice of a father fabricating federal evidence against his own daughter violated even the most cynical boundaries of the corporate world. The recording continued, seamlessly transitioning to Jessica's frantic, shrill voice echoing across the room. "You are going to spend the next 10 years covering our tracks, or you are going to spend them in a federal penitentiary." I paused the audio. I let the silence hang heavy and suffocating before I turned slowly to face my father at the podium. Richard looked physically diminished. His shoulders slumped. His hands gripped the edges of the mahogany stand, not for authority, but for physical support to keep from collapsing. The sweat on his forehead dripped down the side of his face, staining the crisp white collar of his tuxedo shirt. He opened his mouth desperately, trying to formulate a defense, a lie, anything to stop the bleeding. "Claire, please," Richard croaked into his own microphone. His voice was small, pathetic, and stripped of all its former arrogance. "This is a private matter. We can resolve this quietly. You do not need to do this." I stared at the man who spent 30 years demanding my submission. I looked at the man who authorized a police raid on my home and threatened me with federal prison to save his own skin. "You built this stage," Richard J. replied, my voice echoing coldly through the cavernous room. "You invited the audience. You wanted a celebration of your legacy. I am simply providing the documentation. The fraud, the extortion, the betrayal. This is your legacy, and it ends tonight." I did not drop the microphone. I turned the power switch to the off position, silencing my connection to the room. I set the device gently down on the edge of the stage. The dual screens continued to display the damning financial ledgers, burning the evidence into the retinas of every investor in Chicago. The humiliation was total, absolute, and painfully public. There was nowhere left to hide. The illusion of the Preston Empire had officially shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The devastating echo of the recorded confession still hung in the stagnant air of the ballroom. The twin projection screens continued to display the fraudulent financial ledgers in stark, unforgiving resolution. Richard stood behind the mahogany podium, physically diminished and stripped of his arrogance. The collective judgment of 300 affluent guests pressed down on him, suffocating his attempts to salvage a defensible narrative. He looked frantically toward the exit doors, his eyes darting across the dimly lit perimeter of the room. He expected a rapid response force. He anticipated his loyal security team rushing the stage to cut the power, remove me, and violently reassert control over his crumbling domain. "Security," Richard roared into his microphone. The sound was ragged, a desperate screech tearing from his throat. "Get this woman off the stage immediately. Shut down those projectors. Secure the exits." The command resonated loudly, but it triggered no response. The men in the dark suits stationed near the heavy brass doors did not flinch. They maintained their rigid, alert postures, their hands resting neutrally in front of them. The audio technician standing a few feet from me simply crossed his arms and looked away, entirely unconcerned by the screaming patriarch. Richard slammed his fist against the podium. "Did you hear me?" He bellowed, his face contorting into an ugly mask of panic and rage. "I demand security to clear this stage right now." A calm, resonant voice cut through the ensuing silence, originating from the center aisle of the ballroom. "Your security personnel were reassigned 30 minutes ago, Richard." Julian stepped out from the hushed crowd. He moved with a terrifying, deliberate grace. The ambient light of the chandeliers seemed to gather around the sharp lines of his bespoke black suit. He bypassed the velvet steps, entirely mirroring my earlier approach, and vaulted smoothly onto the edge of the stage. He stood tall, projecting a lethal, unyielding authority that dwarfed my father's frantic posturing. Julian walked slowly toward the podium. He did not rush. He did not shout. He moved with the inevitable, crushing momentum of a glacier. Richard recoiled slightly, taking a half-step back from the microphone. He looked at the man he had previously dismissed as a pathetic scavenger, a parasite wearing a faded linen jacket. The illusion shattered instantly. The man approaching him possessed the resources to dismantle his life with a single phone call, and Richard finally recognized the true scale of his fatal miscalculation. Julian stopped directly in front of the podium, closing the physical distance. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. His movements were slow, precise, and deliberately theatrical, ensuring every eye in the room focused on the action. He withdrew a thick, legal-sized envelope secured with a heavy red wax seal. The insignia stamped into the wax was the unmistakable crest of Kensington Holdings. Julian held the envelope up, allowing the spotlight to catch the stark red wax. "You operate under the persistent delusion that I am an insignificant analyst clinging to a powerful surname," Julian stated. His voice carried across the silent ballroom without the aid of a microphone. The acoustic power of his delivery commanded absolute attention. "You assumed my presence in your home was a vulnerability you could exploit for insider trading. You assumed you could intimidate me into silence while you extorted my fiancé." Julian took a slow step forward, forcing Richard to press his back uncomfortably against the wooden frame of the podium. "Allow me to formally introduce myself." Julian continued his tone, dropping an octave into a cold, menacing register. "My name is Julian Kensington. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Kensington Holdings, and I am the man who holds the debt you so desperately tried to hide." The title reverberated through the stunned audience. The murmurs erupted instantly. Chief Executive Officer. The man Richard Preston had slapped, insulted, and attempted to blackmail was not a junior employee. He was the reigning king of the private equity sector. The sheer magnitude of Richard's error defied comprehension. Julian broke the red wax seal with a sharp snap. He pulled a thick stack of heavily watermarked legal documents from the envelope. The paper rustled loudly in the tense quiet of the stage. "This," Julian announced, lifting the top document for Richard to see, "is an official notice of default. It confirms that Preston Realty has failed to meet the critical liquidity covenants outlined in your $50 million mezzanine loan agreement." Richard reached out a trembling hand, attempting to grasp the document, but Julian pulled it back slightly, keeping it just out of reach. "Your attempt to forge financial ledgers and frame Claire for corporate embezzlement triggered the immediate acceleration clause in our master contract," Julian explained methodically. "We do not tolerate fraudulent activity from our debtors. Furthermore, the margin calls executed by my financial team this afternoon have completely depleted your offshore reserves. You are insolvent, Richard. You are bankrupt." Julian held the thick stack of legal documents firmly in his hand. He looked Richard directly in the eyes. "As of 8 o'clock tonight, Kensington Holdings has officially initiated asset forfeiture protocols," Julian declared. "The $50 million debt is now secured against your collateral. We have seized controlling equity of Preston Realty. We have frozen your personal banking accounts. The deed to your primary residence and your corporate headquarters are currently undergoing legal transfer to our holding firm." The words landed like physical blows. Every sentence stripped away a layer of Richard's identity. His company, his home, his fortune, all eradicated within a 60-second monologue. "You no longer own the chair you sit in," Julian said softly, ensuring the finality of the statement penetrated Richard's panicked mind. "You no longer own the suit you are wearing. You have nothing." Julian did not hand the documents to Richard politely. He did not place them gently on the podium. With a sudden, forceful motion, Julian slammed the thick stack of legal papers directly into Richard's chest. The impact knocked Richard off balance. He staggered backward, his hands instinctively coming up to catch the heavy packet. But his coordination failed. The documents slipped from his desperate grasp. The papers burst apart upon hitting the floor. Dozens of heavily watermarked pages scattered across the stage, floating down like the ash of a burning empire. The notice of default landed face up near Richard's polished dress shoes, glaring under the harsh stage lights. Richard stared down at the scattered pages. His chest heaved with shallow, frantic breaths. He looked up at Julian, then over to me. His mouth worked silently, trying to find a word, an excuse, a command that could reverse the catastrophe. He found nothing but the cold, impassive stares of the people he tried to destroy. The financial guillotine had dropped, and the execution was absolute. The sharp rustle of the legal documents scattering across the stage served as the starting gun for the total collapse of the Preston family facade. The immaculate illusion of unified wealth and generational loyalty disintegrated before the final page settled on the floorboards. The realization that Kensington Holdings had effectively seized control of their entire existence triggered a rapid, brutal descent into survival mode. There is no loyalty among thieves when the federal authorities secure the perimeter. Through the heavy brass doors of the ballroom, a new contingent entered. They did not wear tuxedos or the dark tactical suits of private security. They wore federal windbreakers. 6 agents from the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network moved down the center aisle, their badges flashing under the crystal chandeliers. They carried thick manila folders containing the unredacted evidence I had compiled. The ghost ledger had officially landed on their desks, and they were here to collect. Marcus saw the federal agents approaching. He recognized the unmistakable posture of men preparing to make high-profile arrests. The arrogant venture capitalist, who had spent years hiding behind his father-in-law's influence, instantly realized the shield had vanished. He was exposed, his fraudulent wire transfers and forged returns glaringly obvious to the approaching investigators. Marcus did not hesitate. He abandoned his wife and sprinted toward the edge of the stage, pushing past a group of stunned state senators. "Wait!" Marcus screamed, waving his arms frantically to intercept the lead federal agent. His voice hit a high, panicked register, stripping away the polished baritone he used in boardrooms. "I am cooperating. I have information. I am a victim of coercion." The lead agent paused, observing the desperate man with clinical detachment. Marcus pointed an accusatory finger directly at Richard, who still stood trembling behind the podium, and then aimed it sharply at his wife Jessica, who remained frozen near the bar. "I was a figurehead." Marcus babbled the words, tumbling out in a frantic rush to secure a plea deal before the handcuffs came out. Richard controlled the offshore routing. He threatened to pull his venture capital backing if I did not sign the transfer authorizations. Jessica managed the domestic accounts. She knew about the dummy corporations in the Caymans. They orchestrated the entire embezzlement scheme to cover their toxic real estate losses. I was just following orders to protect my firm. "I have emails. I have text messages. I will give you everything." They framed Claire to cover their tracks. The betrayal was instantaneous and absolute. Marcus threw his family under the proverbial bus the moment the flashing lights appeared. Jessica heard the accusations echoing across the quiet ballroom. The golden child, the sister who spent her life wrapped in designer labels and unearned superiority, snapped. The realization that her husband was actively trading her freedom for a reduced sentence shattered her fragile composure. Jessica let out a guttural, furious scream. She dropped her crystal wine glass. It shattered against the marble floor, but the sound barely registered over her shrieking. "You lying, pathetic coward!" Jessica roared, hiking up the skirt of her heavy scarlet gown and charging toward the stage. She did not maintain her elegant posture. She launched herself at Marcus with explosive violence. She collided with his chest, driving him backward into a cocktail table. The table tipped over, sending a cascade of hors d'oeuvres and ice water crashing to the floor. Jessica grabbed the lapels of his custom velvet jacket, her manicured nails digging deeply into his neck. "You forged those documents!" Jessica shrieked, striking him across the face with the heel of her hand. "You lost $12 million on a biometric scam and came crying to my father to bail you out. You dragged this family into the mud and now you try to blame me. I will kill you, Marcus. I will kill you." Marcus raised his arms, attempting to shield his face from her frantic blows, but Jessica fought with the unhinged intensity of a woman watching her life evaporate. She clawed at his cheek, leaving sharp, bleeding scratches across his skin. The polished power couple devolved into a chaotic, primitive brawl in the center of the gala. The federal agents did not immediately intervene. They watched the spectacle, allowing the suspects to loudly incriminate each other in front of 300 witnesses. On the stage, the chaos triggered a different reaction from the matriarch. Diana had watched her husband lose his empire, her son-in-law confess to federal crimes, and her daughter attack a man in a puddle of spilled water. The social capital she spent decades hoarding vanished into thin air. Diana did not fight. She crumbled. She stumbled forward, her knees giving out completely. She collapsed onto the floor of the stage, the silk fabric of her expensive gown pooling around her in a disheveled mess. She crawled toward the spot where I stood beside Julian, her hands reaching out in frantic desperation. Diana wrapped her arms around my legs, gripping the fabric of my black slacks near the knees. She buried her face against my shins, sobbing loudly, a wet, humiliating sound that echoed through the microphone I had left resting on the stage floor. "Claire, please." Diana wailed, her voice thick with tears and mucus. Her meticulously styled hair fell into her face, ruining the perfect image she cultivated for the gala. Please, you have to stop this. Tell him to stop. We are your family. You are my daughter. You cannot let them take our home. You cannot let them put your father in a cell. We were just trying to protect the legacy. We made mistakes, but we love you, Claire. Please have mercy. Have mercy on your mother." She looked up at me, her makeup running in dark streaks down her cheeks. The woman who had thrown hot coffee on me in a cafe, the woman who had demanded I sign away my grandmother's equity, was now begging for scraps from the daughter she despised. It was a grotesque, pathetic display. The financial elite of Chicago, the people Diana desperately tried to impress, watched the spectacle with unmasked disgust. These were men and women who dealt in cold logic and ruthless acquisitions. They recognized weakness, and they abhorred public humiliation. One by one, the wealthy investors turned their backs on the stage. The state senators quietly slipped toward the exit doors. The managing partners murmured quietly to their spouses, checking their coats at the cloakroom. The elite did not offer a hand to help Richard up. They did not try to separate Jessica and Marcus. They simply walked away, distancing themselves from the toxic fallout of the Preston family implosion. The grand ballroom, designed to celebrate 35 years of corporate dominance, became a hollow echoing chamber filled only with the sounds of a family violently tearing itself apart. The rats were trapped in the sinking ship, and they were finally turning their teeth on each other. The spectacle on the ballroom floor continued its ugly, desperate descent. Federal agents finally moved in to separate Jessica and Marcus, pulling them apart as they continued to hurl furious, incriminating accusations at each other. The remaining guests were filing out of the brass doors in a swift, silent exodus, unwilling to be associated with the catastrophic collapse of the Preston family. I stood on the edge of the stage, looking down at the woman gripping my legs, her tears soaking into the fabric of my catering uniform. I did not feel a sudden surge of pity. I did not feel the familiar heavy ache of a daughter watching her mother break down. The psychological tethers that bound me to this family for 30 years had snapped the moment Richard's hand struck my face in the dining room. I looked at Diana sobbing and pleading for mercy, and I felt absolutely nothing. The emotional well was entirely dry. I reached down with slow, deliberate precision. I did not yank my leg away violently. I simply placed my hands over Diana's frantic, clutching fingers. Her grip was surprisingly strong, fueled by the primal panic of a woman watching her social standing evaporate. I peeled her fingers back one by one, methodically detaching her grip from my uniform. Diana looked up at me, her eyes wide with desperate hope, anticipating a concession. She expected the compliant, invisible daughter to resurface and offer comfort. She expected me to negotiate with Julian to beg for a stay of execution on her behalf. I let her hands fall limply to her sides. I crouched down, bringing my face level with hers. "Do you remember what you told me in the dining room the night I brought Julian home?" I asked. My voice was quiet, a steady murmur cutting through the ambient chaos of the room. It held no anger, no vindictive edge. It was just a cold, undeniable recitation of the facts. Diana blinked, confused by the question amidst the unfolding disaster. She shook her head, weakly, tears streaking her expensive foundation. "You told me that the Preston family does not associate with scavengers," I reminded her softly. "You told me we do not mix with people who beg for change on the street. You wanted to protect the pristine legacy of this empire from anyone you deemed beneath you." I stood back up, looking down at her crumpled form on the stage floor. "You were entirely correct, Diana," I stated, my voice projecting clearly over the commotion of the federal agents securing Marcus in handcuffs. "We do not associate with scavengers. And beginning tomorrow morning, when the bank locks the gates to your estate and the feds freeze your personal checking accounts, you will realize exactly who the scavengers are. You will have no home, no trust funds, and no credit. You will be the very people you spent your life looking down upon." Diana gasped, covering her mouth with her trembling hands. The finality of the statement crushed the last remnants of her hope. She understood there would be no reprieve, no secret familial loyalty to save her from the consequences of her complicity. I turned my attention away from her and looked toward the podium. Richard stood leaning heavily against the wooden frame. His face was a sickly pale gray, and he was taking shallow, rapid breaths, clutching his left hand tightly against his chest. The adrenaline crash, combined with the sheer terror of federal prison, was taking a severe physical toll on his body. He looked like a fragile, broken old man, entirely stripped of the terrifying authority he wielded for decades. I walked slowly across the stage, stopping a few feet from the podium. Richard looked up at me, his eyes clouded with a frantic, suffocating fear. He did not speak. He did not issue a command. He simply waited for the final blow. "You struck my face because I brought a stranger into your sanctuary," I said, keeping my tone measured and clinical. "You believed your wealth gave you the right to inflict physical violence to enforce your control. You thought you owned the world, Richard." I gestured to the scattered notice of default pages littering the floor around his feet. "Julian's firm owns this building now," I continued. "They own your corporate headquarters. They own the marble dining room where you hit me. You are no longer the master of the house, Richard. You are a trespasser. When the authorities finish processing you tonight, I suggest you get very comfortable with the concept of being a stranger on the street, because that is the only place left for you to go." I did not wait for a response. I did not need one. The absolute silence from the man who used to terrorize me was the only confirmation required. The illusion of the formidable patriarch had vanished, replaced by a hollow shell waiting for the federal transport van. I turned my back on Richard and Diana. I walked toward the edge of the stage where Julian waited patiently. The chaos of the arrests and the fleeing guests blurred into the background. Julian extended his hand once more. I placed my hand in his. The warmth of his grip anchored me, a stark contrast to the cold devastation we left in our wake. We did not look back at the stage. We did not pause to watch the agents escort Marcus and Jessica out the service doors. We walked down the center aisle of the grand ballroom, moving through the empty space where the Chicago elite had gathered mere hours before. As we reached the heavy brass doors of the main entrance, the wail of approaching sirens pierced the quiet night air. The sharp, oscillating sound of police cruisers pulling up to the hotel entrance echoed through the lobby. The authorities were arriving to dismantle the final pieces of the Preston Empire. We stepped out into the cool Chicago evening, leaving the wreckage behind, stepping forward into a future built entirely on our own terms. 30 days later, the wrought iron gates of the Preston estate remained chained shut. A heavy brass padlock secured the main entrance, replacing the private security detail that once guarded the perimeter. A bright yellow foreclosure notice was taped directly onto the polished mahogany front door. The sprawling marble mansion, once a fortress of arrogance and stolen wealth, stood entirely silent. The luxury vehicles no longer lined the circular driveway. The landscaping crew had ceased their weekly visits, allowing weeds to creep through the pristine brick pavers. The federal authorities had moved through the property with surgical precision. Armed agents tagged and removed every piece of valuable artwork, every antique vase, and every piece of designer furniture to auction off for civil restitution. Diana Preston's beloved domain was reduced to a hollow, echoing shell. She was currently renting a cramped single-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the industrial district. She relied on the exact government assistance program she used to actively mock at her charity galas. She had no maids, no drivers, and no social standing. She was forced to carry her own groceries up 3 flights of concrete stairs. Richard Preston did not return to his corner executive office. He traded his tailored Italian suits for standard-issue federal apparel. The sentencing hearing took place on a rainy Tuesday morning in a federal district court downtown. I did not attend the proceeding. I read the court transcripts provided by the Kensington Holdings legal department. The presiding judge showed zero leniency toward the fallen patriarch. The sheer volume of evidence contained within the ghost ledger, combined with the pristine audio recording of Richard coordinating perjury and extortion, left his defense attorneys with nothing but empty pleas for mercy. The prosecution played the recording of Richard threatening to frame me for embezzlement. The gavel fell, cementing a 15-year sentence in a minimum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. Richard would be well into his 70s by the time he tasted fresh air again. His legacy was permanently erased. His name, once feared and respected across the Chicago real estate market, was now synonymous with corporate fraud and hubris. He spends his days assigned to the prison laundry facility, washing the uniforms of men he once considered beneath his notice. Marcus fared no better under the crushing weight of the federal probe. The Securities and Exchange Commission stripped him of his trading licenses within 48 hours of the gala confrontation. Federal investigators froze every domestic and offshore account tied to his venture capital firm. They uncovered a labyrinth of Ponzi schemes and fabricated returns that extended far beyond the initial $12 million deficit I had identified. Marcus was currently awaiting trial, confined to a federal holding cell, stripped of his smug demeanor and his affluent network. He tried to offer a plea deal by implicating Richard further, hoping to secure a reduced sentence by turning state evidence. The authorities declined his offer. They already possessed all the evidence they needed from my encrypted drives. Marcus had nothing left to trade. His carefully constructed persona as an elite financial genius shattered, leaving behind a desperate criminal facing decades of incarceration. Jessica attempted to salvage her own comfortable existence while the men in her life faced ruin. She filed for divorce the morning after the gala, citing irreconcilable differences and claiming total ignorance of her husband's criminal activities. The divorce courts were not amused by her performance. Because she had knowingly signed joint tax returns and actively participated in hiding illicit assets in offshore accounts, the presiding judge ruled her equally liable for the civil restitution penalties. Jessica's diamond necklaces, her luxury SUV, and her exclusive country club memberships were seized by court order and liquidated to pay back the defrauded investors. The golden child, who had spent her entire adult life sneering at the working class and treating service staff like disposable commodities, found herself facing a crippling mountain of debt. To satisfy the court-mandated payment schedule and afford basic rent, Jessica was forced to secure formal employment for the first time in her life. She currently works 40 hours a week as a cashier at a discount grocery store in the suburbs. She spends her days standing on hard linoleum floors, scanning barcodes and bagging produce for customers who do not care about her maiden name or her former social status. Her hands, once perfectly manicured, are now dry and cracked from handling cardboard boxes and harsh cleaning chemicals. The irony of her new reality delivered a profound, unyielding justice. I did not dwell on their misery. I had a new empire to build, and I no longer operated in the shadows. I sat behind a sleek, minimalist desk in a corner office on the 50th floor of the Kensington Holdings tower. The floor-to-ceiling glass windows offered an unobstructed panoramic view of the Chicago skyline and the vast expanse of the lake. The sunlight poured into the room, illuminating the stark, clean lines of my workspace. A heavy brass nameplate rested near my dual monitors. It read, "Claire Kensington, Chief Financial Officer of Asset Recovery." I had earned the title through blood, sweat, and strategic warfare. I spent the last month leading a specialized team of forensic auditors, tracking down every hidden dollar and liquidated asset belonging to the former Preston Empire. We restructured the viable properties, paid back the defrauded investors, and systematically dismantled the fraudulent shell companies. I did not just clean up the mess this time. I owned the machinery performing the sweep. I commanded a team of 50 analysts who respected my expertise and followed my directives without question. The heavy glass door to my office swung open. Julian stepped into the room carrying 2 crystal flutes and a chilled bottle of vintage champagne. He wore a sharp charcoal suit, his presence radiating the same quiet, lethal authority that had brought my father to his knees on the ballroom stage. He walked across the plush carpet and set the glasses down on the edge of my desk. He did not pour the champagne immediately. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and withdrew a single crisp sheet of legal paper. He slid the document across the smooth surface of my desk. I picked up the paper and read the bold text at the top. It was a formal transfer of ownership agreement drafted by the bankruptcy court. The contract detailed the final acquisition of Preston Realty's remaining intellectual property, corporate branding, and foundational assets. I scanned down to the purchase price listed at the bottom of the page. The figure was clearly typed in bold black ink, $1. "I purchased the remnants of your father's legacy this morning," Julian stated, his voice a low, resonant hum that filled the quiet office. The bankruptcy judge approved the final liquidation sale. I thought it was a fitting valuation for a company built entirely on lies and stolen capital. I picked up a silver pen from my desk organizer. I signed my name on the witness line, finalizing the transaction with a smooth, decisive stroke. I slid the document back to Julian. The Preston Empire was officially erased, bought for the spare change one might find on a sidewalk. The legacy Richard Preston had sacrificed his own daughter to protect was now reduced to a single sheet of paper in my possession. Julian popped the cork on the champagne bottle. The soft, festive pop echoed in the quiet office, a sound of genuine victory rather than forced celebration. He poured the sparkling liquid into the crystal flutes and handed one to me. I stood up from my ergonomic leather chair and met his gaze. There was no lingering grief in my chest. There was no hollow ache for a family reunion or a tearful reconciliation. I did not forgive Richard for his violence, Diana for her cruelty, or Jessica for her arrogant abuse. Some bridges are not meant to be rebuilt. They are meant to be burned to the ground so you can see clearly by the light of the flames. We raised our glasses. The fine crystal clinked together with a sharp, definitive ring. We drank to cold justice, to unbreakable boundaries, and to a new empire built securely from the ashes of those who once tried to bury us. People often ask me if I feel a sense of lingering guilt for dismantling my own bloodline. The truth is, I did not dismantle anything. I simply handed them the mirror they spent decades avoiding. I stepped out of the line of fire and let the heavy consequences of their own arrogance crush them into dust. Surviving the Preston family taught me how to deconstruct a fraudulent corporate empire, but more importantly, it taught me how to construct an unbreakable reality for myself. If you are watching this and recognize the same toxic dynamics within your own home, I want you to carry these 3 distinct truths with you as you forge your own path. First blood does not entitle anyone to your subjugation. Society conditions us to believe that family requires infinite patience and unconditional forgiveness. That is a convenient lie designed to keep victims tethered to their abusers. True loyalty is an equitable exchange earned through consistent respect and mutual care. When people weaponize the concept of family to demand your silence or exploit your labor, they forfeit the right to claim you as their own. You possess the undeniable right to sever that cord. You are allowed to lock the door and walk away without carrying a single ounce of guilt. Second, your composure is your most lethal asset. When narcissistic individuals attempt to provoke you, they crave a chaotic reaction. They want the screaming match. They want the tears. They want you to lose control so they can label you hysterical and validate their own abuse. Do not hand them the satisfaction of a reaction. Retreat into the quiet. Gather your evidence methodically. Build your legal and financial strategy while they celebrate their temporary fragile victories. A loud threat is just empty noise, but a silent, calculated execution permanently shifts the balance of power. Finally, never let the people who exploit your talents determine your market value. My father confined me to a basement office and treated my expertise like disposable labor. He desperately needed to keep me small so he could feel large. Your intrinsic value is not dictated by the people who profit from your insecurity. You set your own price in this world. When you finally recognize your own leverage, the people who underestimated you will realize their fatal mistake far too late. My name is Claire. I reclaimed my life by knowing my worth and refusing to surrender it to those who sought to break me. Thank you for listening to my journey today. If you found strength in this resolution, please hit the like button and leave a comment sharing your own experiences with setting unyielding boundaries. Make sure to subscribe to Olivia Stories Revenge for more stories about people who refuse to stay in the shadows and take back the power they rightfully deserve. Until next time, stay sharp, stay prepared, and never let anyone write your final chapter.